There is a mountain in central Greece called Oeta, and on a clear night, from its highest ridge, you can see what feels like the entire ancient world laid out below you. The Aegean to the east, dark and silver under starlight. The valleys of Thessaly to the north, quiet and breathing in the dark. The smell of pine resin and sea salt carried up on the same wind that bends the torchlight sideways. It is a beautiful place, and it is where the greatest hero the ancient world ever produced lay down and asked a friend to light the fire that would end his suffering. His name was Hercules. By the time he climbed that mountain, he had defeated every monster the ancient world could throw at him. He had strangled lions, outwitted gods, walked through the gates of the underworld, and come back. He had held up the sky on his shoulders. He had done 12 impossible things before most men had done one. But the thing that finally broke him was a shirt. That is not a metaphor. It was a real shirt, sent by someone who loved him, soaked in something she believed was a love charm. She did not know it was poison. She did not know that the Centaur who told her about it had been waiting decades for his revenge. Patient, as only the dying can be patient. She did not know, and he forgave her for it. That is one of the things about Hercules that gets lost in the stories about the monsters. He was good at forgiving people. He was just never very good at forgiving himself. This is the full story of his life. The birth that made him an enemy before he could speak. The crime that broke him in the middle of everything good he had built. The 12 labors that were never really about monsters at all. The years after, when freedom turned out to feel nothing like what he had imagined. And the mountain at the end, where the mortal part of him finally burned away, and whatever had always been underneath rose up into that star-filled sky above Oeta. It is a long story. It deserves to be told slowly. So settle in. The story will find you either way. Before we talk about Hercules, we have to talk about the world he was born into. Because he did not arrive in a simple place. He arrived in a cosmos that had been running on power, desire, and unresolved anger for longer than human memory could hold. The Greeks imagined their gods living on a mountain in northern Thessaly called Olympus, and when you hear that word, you might picture something serene, white marble, golden light, wise immortals, looking down on humanity with patient, generous eyes. The reality, at least according to every ancient source that ever wrote about it, was considerably more complicated. Olympus was a family, and like a great many powerful families, it was held together not by harmony but by hierarchy, and underneath the hierarchy ran currents of old wounds that never fully healed. The gods loved each other in the way that people who have known each other forever sometimes love each other, which is to say deeply, and sometimes destructively, and occasionally both at the same time. At the top of this family was Zeus, king of the gods, lord of lightning, ruler of the sky and everything beneath it. He was not a simple figure in the ancient source. He appears as a genuine king in the old sense, meaning his authority was real and his power was absolute. But his virtue was complicated. He could be just. He could be generous. He could see the long arc of fate with a clarity that no mortal could match. He was also, by any honest accounting, a spectacularly unfaithful husband. The list of Zeus's affairs is one of the most extensive in all of mythology. Mortal women, goddesses, nymphs. He pursued them across every corner of the ancient world, wearing disguises, bending rules, leaving behind children who carried his divine blood, and also, almost without exception, his divine complication. But here is the part that matters for our story. Standing next to Zeus in every account, wearing her crown and her dignity and the particular expression of a woman who has decided that composure is the only weapon left to her, was Hera. Picture Olympus on an ordinary evening. the light coming through the great halls in long golden shafts, the smell of ambrosia and wild honey. Hera, seated at the high table, every inch the queen, and across the room a messenger arriving with the kind of news she has learned to read before a word is spoken. The slight hesitation, the careful tone, another name, another city, another woman Zeus has chosen. She has heard this before, many times. She will hear it again. Hera was not a minor goddess. She was the queen of Olympus, the protector of marriage and family, one of the most widely worshipped deities in the entire Greek world. Her temples stood in every major city. Her festivals drew enormous crowds. She was powerful, intelligent, and deeply committed to the institution of marriage as something sacred and worth protecting. And her own marriage was the most publicly humiliated in the cosmos. Every new affair of Zeus was another announcement that her position as wife meant less to him than a passing desire. Every child born to a mortal woman was a living advertisement for how little he valued her. She could not leave. She could not make him stop. She was the goddess of marriage, and her marriage was an ongoing demonstration of exactly how little that title could protect you when the person you were married to simply did not care. The ancient writers record dozens of moments where Hera's anger found a target. She went after the women Zeus loved. She punished the children he fathered. She created obstacles and curses and suffering for everyone connected to his infidelities. And generations of readers have called her a villain for it. But here is the thing. Hera was not wrong to be angry. She was wrong about where she directed that anger. Wrong about the targets she chose. Wrong about the scale of suffering she created. The mortal women Zeus pursued were not her enemies. The children born from those encounters were not her enemies. They were, in their own ways, also people who had been pulled into something not of their choosing. But the anger itself, the deep and abiding fury of a powerful woman who had been systematically disrespected by the person who owed her the most respect, that was not madness. That was the entirely predictable result of being treated as though your dignity did not matter. We need to understand this about Hera before we can understand what she did to Hercules, because what she did to him was genuinely terrible. It caused suffering on a scale that is hard to fully comprehend, and it also came from a place that, if we are honest with ourselves, we can recognize. She had been hurt. She was still being hurt. And when Zeus came home one evening with the particular look of a man who had something to tell her, she already knew, because she always already knew, that it was going to hurt again. His name would be Hercules. He did not exist yet. He was not even a certainty. He was a decision Zeus had made. A plan involving a mortal woman in a city called Thebes. And what he would become was still years away. But Hera knew what he would be. Another son of Zeus. Another walking proof of her humiliation. Another child who would grow up powerful and celebrated while she stood to the side and absorbed the public reminder of what her marriage actually was. She made a decision that night. This one, she would not ignore. She did not know, in that moment, the full shape that her opposition would eventually take. She only knew that she was tired of standing to the side, and that the child coming into the world in Thebes was going to understand, from his very first breath, that the world was not a simple or forgiving place. The gods of Olympus were not so different from the families that would one day build temples in their honor. They loved each other. They hurt each other. And sometimes, the ones who got hurt the most were the ones who had never been part of the argument at all. The city of Thebes sat in the middle of the Greek mainland like a place that had decided, very early on, that history was going to happen to it, whether it wanted that or not. It had been built by a Phoenician prince, fought over by gods and men, destroyed and rebuilt more times than its citizens could comfortably count. By the time our story reaches it, Thebes was a city that knew how to absorb extraordinary things and keep moving. It was about to absorb something extraordinarily strange. The man at the center of it was named Amphitryon. He was a general, a nobleman, a man of genuine courage and reasonable intelligence who had built a good life through competence and loyalty. He loved his wife. He was faithful to her. He was, by the standards of his time and place, an admirable human being. His wife was named Alcmene, and she was, by every ancient account that mentions her, exceptional. The sources describe her as the most beautiful mortal woman of her generation, which in Greek mythology is a description that tends to come with consequences attached. But what the sources emphasize almost as much as her appearance is her character. She was loyal, principled, and possessed of a moral seriousness that was unusual in a world where the powerful tended to make their own rules. She had married Amphitryon because she chose him. She intended to honor that choice for the rest of her life. She did not know that someone else had also made a choice about her life. Someone considerably more powerful than she was, and considerably less interested in what she wanted. Zeus had been watching Alcmene for some time. He had decided he wanted her. And when Zeus decided he wanted something, the machinery of divine will began to move in that direction with the slow, irresistible momentum of weather. The plan he settled on was, even by his own standards, audacious. Amphitryon was away on a military campaign. The city was waiting for his return. Alcmene was waiting for his return. And into that space of waiting, Zeus arrived wearing her husband's face, her husband's voice, her husband's memories, every detail of the man she loved, rendered with a precision that no mortal forgery could have matched. He was not approximately Amphitryon. He was Amphitryon in every way that Alcmene had any means of detecting. The ancient sources handle this moment differently, depending on who is telling the story and when. But if we sit with it honestly, what Zeus did that night was take something that did not belong to him, using a deception so complete that consent, in any meaningful sense of the word, was not possible. Alcmene was not choosing Zeus. She believed she was with her husband. The distinction matters. The story does not pretend otherwise, even when it does not say so directly. What Zeus did next, and this detail survives in nearly every version of the myth, was make the night last. He spoke to Helios, the god of the sun, and arranged for the sun not to rise. He stretched that single night into the length of 3, holding the darkness in place over Thebes, while the rest of the world waited in a strange, suspended quiet that people noticed but could not explain. The city slept longer than cities are supposed to sleep. The birds did not sing at their usual hour. The fishermen who rose before dawn to reach the harbor found that dawn was not there to meet them. Something had paused the ordinary machinery of the world. And in that pause, in that extended and unnatural darkness, the child who would become Hercules was conceived. The universe was making room for something it had never quite made room for before. When dawn finally came, as it eventually had to, Alcmene woke with a sense she could not name. Something felt different. The room looked the same. The morning light came through the same window it always did. But something in the air had shifted. The way a room feels different when the furniture has been moved slightly, and you cannot immediately identify what has changed. She did not know yet. She would not know for some time. The real Amphitryon arrived home that same day, still dusty from the road, still carrying the particular relief of a soldier who has survived something and made it back to the people he loves. He came to her with everything genuine, everything that was actually his to give. And Alcmene, confused by something she could not explain, asked him about the night before. He had no idea what she was talking about. The conversation that followed was, by all accounts, extremely difficult. Amphitryon consulted the prophet Tiresias, who told him the truth. Zeus had come to his home. Zeus had taken his form, and the child that would come from that night was not entirely his. The ancient sources tell us that Amphitryon accepted this, that he honored Alcmene, that he raised the child, that he did not punish her for something that had happened entirely outside her control. This is presented as a mark of his character, and it is. But it is also worth acknowledging what it cost him to arrive at that acceptance, what it means to be told that the most powerful being in the cosmos walked into your life wearing your own face. Some things cannot be fully absorbed. They can only be lived with. Several weeks later, Alcmene realized she was carrying not one child but two conceptions, close together in time. Two different fathers. One child who carried the blood of the greatest god in the universe. One child who was fully, entirely, ordinarily human. The human child would be named Iphicles. He would grow up to be a good man, a capable soldier, someone who lived a life of recognizable human scale, with recognizable human joys and sorrows. He would stand next to his brother at various points in the story and occasionally wonder, in the quiet way that people wonder about roads not taken, what it would have felt like to be born the other one. His brother did not yet have a name. He had a destiny, which is a heavier thing to carry than a name. Hera, watching all of this from Olympus, had already begun to plan. She could not undo what Zeus had done. She could not reach back into that long, stretched night and unmake it. But she could shape what came after. She could ensure that the child arriving in Thebes would not simply walk into a world that welcomed him. The child was coming. There was nothing she could do about that. But what happened to him after he arrived? That was still very much an open question. Two boys, same mother, same house, same sky above them at night. But one of them would grow up to hold that sky on his shoulders, and the other would grow old watching from a comfortable distance, grateful every day that the gods had not noticed him. He was born in the way that extraordinary things often arrive, without announcement, without the world pausing to acknowledge that something had changed. Alcmene labored and delivered, and there were two boys where there had been one woman, and the house in Thebes filled with the ordinary chaos of new life. The baby who would become Hercules was, by all visible measures, a healthy infant, larger than average, quieter than his brother, who announced his presence with considerable enthusiasm. He had dark eyes that tracked movement with an attention that seemed, to the people around him, slightly ahead of schedule. Amphitryon looked at him and loved him. Whatever complicated feelings lived underneath that love. The love itself was real. This was the child of his household. He would raise him as his own. Alcmene held him and felt something she did not have a word for, a mixture of joy and awe, and the particular apprehension of a person holding something they sense is larger than their ability to contain it. Hera moved quickly. Within weeks of the birth, she sent two serpents to the nursery. The ancient world described them as enormous, as creatures that did not belong to the ordinary natural world. They came at night, moving through the dark house with the patient, purposeful quiet of things that have been sent with instructions. The house was still. The oil lamp on the table burned low, throwing soft shadows across the walls. Iphicles was asleep in his cradle, his small fists curled against his chest. The baby, who would be Hercules, was also still, breathing in the slow, even rhythm of a child, deep in sleep. The serpents entered. Iphicles woke up. He did what any infant would do when faced with two large serpents in the dark. He screamed, with everything his lungs contained. The full and total alarm of a small person encountering something terrifying. His brother did not scream. Amphitryon heard the noise and ran. He came through the door with a sword already in his hand, ready for whatever threat had found his household. What he found stopped him in the doorway. The baby who would be Hercules was sitting upright in his cradle. He was holding a serpent in each hand, one on the left and one on the right, with the calm, focused grip of a child who had found something interesting to hold on to. The serpents were not moving. They were not going to move again. He had killed them, both of them, with his hands. Before he could walk, Amphitryon stood in the doorway for a long moment, the sword still in his hand, looking at his infant son, holding two dead serpents in the lamplight. Iphicles was still crying somewhere behind him. The rest of the house was starting to stir, servants appearing in doorways, voices asking what had happened. The baby looked up at Amphitryon with the expression of someone waiting to find out whether what he had done was the right thing. No one in that room knew what to say. They brought in Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, who had already helped them navigate one impossible thing and seemed to have developed a specialty in delivering news that was both extraordinary and deeply inconvenient. He sat in the room with the dead serpents and the wide-eyed infant and told them what this meant. The child was under divine attention. The forces opposing him were going to be divine in scale. He would need strength that went beyond the physical, though he would have physical strength in abundance. He would need, more than anything, people around him who understood what they were dealing with. Hera's plan had failed. The serpents were dead. Hercules was alive and demonstrably difficult to kill. But Hera was not finished. She was playing a longer game than a pair of serpents in a nursery. And the fact that this particular move had not worked did not discourage her so much as redirect her. She would wait. The years that followed were, by any measure, remarkable. The child grew faster than children are supposed to grow, and stronger than any child had a right to be, and with a quality of presence that made people stop what they were doing when he entered a room. He was not an easy child to ignore. He was not an easy child at all, in the sense that everything about him was slightly too large for ordinary containers. He was also, underneath all of that, genuinely a child. He wanted what children want. He wanted to be good at things. He wanted the approval of the people around him and the satisfaction of mastering something difficult. He was curious, and sometimes impatient, and capable of a warmth that surprised people who expected someone that large and that powerful to be cold. The mountain above Thebes suited him better than any classroom. On the days when Amphitryon sent him out with the herders or the hunters, he moved through that landscape with an ease he never quite managed inside walls. The pine trees on the upper slopes in morning light, their shadows long and clean across the pale rock, the sound of the wind picking up before a storm. The way it moved through the high grass in waves you could watch, coming from a long way off. The animals up there not afraid of him until they had reason to be. And usually they did not have reason. He was learning what his body could do. More slowly, he was learning what it could not do. And the lessons that required that particular knowledge were always harder and always more expensive. He was not yet 8 years old when Thebes held a festival in honor of the gods. And there was music in every street. And the city felt, for a few days, like a place where ordinary happiness was possible. He walked through it with his brother, and Iphicles ran ahead to see the dancers, and Hercules stood in the middle of a crowded square and felt, for the first time in his young life, something uncomplicated. He did not know how rare that was going to be. No one knew what to do with a child like that. So they did what people have always done with things they do not understand. They told themselves a story about it. They said he was blessed. They said he was chosen. It would be years before anyone admitted that blessed and cursed sometimes look exactly the same from the outside. There is a particular kind of education that powerful people receive, and it is not entirely about knowledge. It is about the construction of an identity. You are shown, from a very young age, what you are supposed to be. The teachers they choose for you, the skills they emphasize, the stories they tell about you in your presence. All of it is a slow and deliberate act of shaping. By the time the education is finished, it can be very difficult to tell where the teaching ended and the person began. Hercules received that kind of education, and the people who designed it had genuinely good intentions. They wanted to give him every possible advantage for the life ahead. They understood, even if they could not fully articulate it, that what was coming for him was going to require more than ordinary preparation. What they could not prepare him for was himself. Amphitryon handled the martial education personally. He was a general, and he knew what it meant to train someone for war. And he approached his son's development with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to a military campaign. Hercules learned to use a sword before he was old enough to shave. He learned strategy alongside technique. The difference between a fight you win with your body and a fight you win before it begins. He learned to read terrain, to think about where the sun would be in an hour, to consider the ground under his feet as a factor in every decision. He was an extraordinary student of these things, not because the physical components required effort, which they did not, but because he was genuinely interested in the strategic dimensions of conflict. He liked thinking about problems. He liked the puzzle of it. For archery, Amphitryon brought in Eurytus of Oechalia, who was regarded as the finest archer in Greece. Eurytus was a man of few words and enormous patience, and he taught Hercules the way he taught everyone, beginning from absolute fundamentals regardless of natural ability, insisting on form before distance, accuracy before speed. There was something about archery that suited a part of Hercules that the combat training did not reach. The stillness it required, the control of breath, the small muscular adjustments that made the difference between a good shot and a perfect one. He took to it with a focus that's... For wrestling, there was Autolycus, who taught him the discipline of using an opponent's force against them, of winning, not by overpowering, but by redirecting. This was harder for Hercules than the archery. His natural instinct was direct. When he felt resistance, everything in him wanted to push back harder, learning to receive force and turn it, to let someone commit to a direction and then simply not be there, required a quality of patience that did not come naturally and took years to develop. And then there was Linus. Linus was the music teacher, the man tasked with the civilizing portion of Hercules' education, the part that was supposed to balance all the weapons training with something that had nothing to do with combat. He was a good teacher and a careful one, and he genuinely liked his student in the way that teachers sometimes like their most difficult pupils, with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion. He taught Hercules the lyre, scales and tuning, the basic theory of Greek music, the difference between modes and what each one was supposed to evoke in a listener. Hercules was not a natural musician the way he was a natural fighter, and this frustrated him more than he expected. He practiced. He improved slowly. He sat with the instrument in his large hands and worked at it with the same focused attention he brought to everything. On a particular afternoon, during what should have been a routine lesson, Linus corrected him. The sources differ on exactly what the correction was about. Some say it was technique. Some say Linus was sharper than usual that day. What they agree on is what happened next. Hercules reacted the way a frustrated teenager reacts. He pushed back, not metaphorically. He was holding the lyre, and he was annoyed, and in a moment that lasted less than a second and could not be taken back, the frustration moved from his mind to his body before his mind had any opportunity to intervene. The lyre struck Linus. Linus did not survive it. The house went quiet in the way that houses go quiet after something irreversible has happened. Hercules stood there, not understanding for a full, terrible moment what had just occurred. Then understanding came, and it was worse than the moment before. He had not meant to hurt anyone. He had been annoyed. The ordinary annoyance of a student who felt unfairly criticized. And the response his body produced to that ordinary feeling was so far beyond the scale of the provocation that there was no framework available for making sense of it. He was a child. The anger was normal. The consequence was not. Amphitryon faced a situation that had no clean solution. His son had killed his teacher. The killing had been unintentional, which was a legal distinction the ancient world recognized. But it did not erase what had happened. There were families involved, questions of responsibility, the complicated machinery of a society trying to figure out what to do when someone causes harm without malice but with devastating effect. Amphitryon handled it as well as he could. He also made a decision that was part punishment and part protection. For his son and for the people around him, he sent Hercules to Mount Cithaeron, in the hills above Thebes, to spend time among the herdsmen who worked the upper pastures, away from the city, away from the situations where ordinary social friction could produce extraordinary damage. Hercules went without argument. He understood, even at his age, something about what had happened that went beyond the specific event. He had felt the gap between what he intended and what he did, and it frightened him in a way that no external threat ever had. Lions and soldiers and the various dangers of the physical world were manageable. You could see them coming. You could prepare. But this, the thing that lived inside his own reactions, the speed of it, the gap between the decision to act and the body's enactment of that decision, that was not something any teacher had trained him for, because no teacher had known it was coming. The mountain received him without judgment. He spent several years there. The herdsmen of Cithaeron were not men of grand ambitions or complex politics. They worked with animals. They watched the weather. They knew the mountain in every season and in every kind of light. Early mornings, when the mist sat in the valleys below and the ridge above was already in clear sun. The smell of wood smoke from the campfires, pine and green oak, different from the charcoal of the city. The particular silence of a mountainside at midday, when the heat was high and the birds had gone quiet, and the only sound was wind through the long grass and the distant bells of the herd. He discovered something unexpected in himself up there. He was capable of gentleness with animals in a way that surprised him. He could gentle a panicked horse without forcing it. He could approach a frightened dog with a patience he had not known he possessed. There was something in the non-verbal communication required, the need to manage his own energy before anything else, that taught him things about himself that the weapons training had not reached. He killed a lion on those slopes, the famous lion of Cithaeron that had been preying on the herds. He tracked it for several days, studied its patterns, and killed it with his bare hands in a narrow ravine where neither of them had room to maneuver. He came back with the skin and told the story simply, without performance. The herdsman listened and said very little, which was how they handled most things, and which Hercules had come to value greatly. He was 17 when he went back down the mountain to Thebes. The city of Orchomenus had been demanding tribute, payment made annually as a form of ongoing submission, and the humiliation of it had been sitting in the city's throat for years. Hercules organized a response that was more strategic than anyone expected from someone his age. When the confrontation came, it was decisive, and Thebes was free of the tribute arrangement. King Creon of Thebes, grateful and impressed, gave Hercules his daughter Megara in marriage. And here, for the first time in his life, Hercules found something that the mountain and the weapons training and all the years of extraordinary preparation had not given him. He found a home. Megara was a woman of good sense and genuine character, and the marriage between them grew over time into something both of them had not expected to find. They had children. The house in Thebes filled with the sounds of ordinary family life, meals and arguments, and the particular music of small people discovering the world. Hercules was good at this. He was a present father, attentive in the way that people who have experienced disorder are sometimes attentive to the ordinary structures of domestic life. He valued what he had. He understood, in the way that people who have come close to losing everything understand, that the unremarkable texture of a normal day is not nothing. It is, in fact, most of what a life is made of. He had been to the mountain. He had learned what his body could do. He had paid a terrible price for the lesson about what it could do unintentionally. He had come back down and built something, for a while, and it was a real while. Not a brief interlude, but years of actual life. He was happy. Hera watched all of this from Olympus, and she waited. He spent those years on the mountain learning what his body could do. The trees did not flinch when he walked past them. The animals were not afraid until they had reason to be. For the first time in his life, Hercules existed somewhere that did not require him to be careful every single moment. He would spend the rest of his life trying to find that feeling again. We have to talk about this carefully. The facts are not uncertain. The ancient sources are in substantial agreement about what happened. But the way a story like this gets told matters enormously. And this particular story has been told badly many times, either softened into something easier to hold, or leaned into for dramatic effect in ways that mistake sensation for meaning. So we will be careful. The years before that night were good ones. This was not a man living in ongoing misery who finally broke under accumulated pressure. This was a man who had found, against considerable odds, something genuinely worth having. The house in Thebes was real. The marriage was real. The children were real. The happiness was real. That is what makes what happened unbearable. Not just the event itself, the fact of what existed before it, and could not exist in the same form afterward. Hercules had been performing labors for Thebes, the voluntary kind, the kind that came from a genuine desire to protect the city and the people in it. He came home one evening to his house, to Megara and to the children, to the ordinary end of a day. Dinner, probably, the children demanding his attention in the way that children do, all at once, each convinced that their particular news cannot wait. He was home. He was where he wanted to be. Then Hera moved. Lusa, the spirit of frenzy, sent by Hera into Hercules with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, when he had the most to lose and was least expecting it. We are not going to describe what happened during the hours that followed. What matters for understanding what this meant, what it cost, and what it made of the man on the other side of it, is not the event itself, but the moment of return. The madness lifted. It lifted the way storms lift sometimes. Not gradually, but completely. The sky going from chaos to stillness between one breath and the next. And Hercules came back into himself the way that people come back from extremity. Confused at first about where he was, registering the physical facts of his surroundings before the meaning of them arrived. The room, the morning light through the window, the quality of silence that was wrong. He looked at his hands. Understanding arrived in pieces, not all at once, because the mind protects itself from the full weight of irreversible things by releasing them slowly. In increments, the self can metabolize. He understood one thing, then another, then what the two things meant together. By the time the full picture was assembled, he was on his knees on the floor of his own house, making a sound the ancient sources struggled to describe, and that we do not need to describe, because anyone who has ever heard a person encounter the worst moment of their life knows what it sounds like. He had not chosen this. The madness was Hera's. The frenzy was sent. The The destruction was not something he had decided or moved toward with any part of his conscious self. He had been used as a weapon against the things he loved most, and none of that changed what had happened. He understood this too. In the same slow unwinding of horror, the absence of intention did not create the presence of what he had lost. The fact that he had been used, that someone else was ultimately responsible for the conditions that made this possible, that he himself was, in some real sense, also a victim of what Hera had done. None of this filled the space in the house where his family had been. He wanted to die. The sources are clear about this. He sat in the ruins of his family and decided that dying was the appropriate response to what he now was. Theseus found him. Theseus, the king of Athens, who was also a hero, who had done his own impossible things and carried his own complicated history, arrived at the house in Thebes and sat down in the wreckage beside his friend. He did not arrive with solutions or philosophy or a plan. He arrived and he sat down and he stayed. He told Hercules, in the plain language that one damaged person sometimes uses with another, that dying would be the easiest thing Hercules could do. That the weight he was trying to escape by dying would simply transfer to everyone who had known him, who would now carry the loss of him on top of everything else. That courage was not the absence of suffering. That the bravest thing available to Hercules in that moment was not death, but the continuation of living, which was going to be the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do, considerably harder than anything that had come before. And then Theseus stayed. That was the crucial part. He did not deliver the speech and leave. He sat there in that destroyed house with his friend, in the silence that follows irreversible things. For as long as it took, Hercules did not die. He went, eventually, to Delphi, the oracle at the temple of Apollo, sitting above the fissure in the rock at Parnassus, breathing the vapors that rose from the earth, speaking the words that the god provided. Hercules went there to ask what he should do, how a person continues after something like this, what the path forward looks like when every path you can see is contaminated by what you now know about yourself. The oracle gave him an answer. It was not the answer he wanted. Go to Tiryns. Serve King Eurystheus for 12 years. Perform whatever tasks he sets you. At the end of it, you will have earned something that cannot be earned any other way. Hercules listened. He did not argue. He had not come to Delphi to negotiate. He had come to find out what to do. And now he knew. He walked out of the temple into the bright afternoon light of Parnassus and stood there for a moment, looking down at the valley below, at the world that was going to have to be lived in. Then he started walking. There is a particular kind of silence that follows irreversible things, not the silence of peace, and not the silence of emptiness. Something in between. The silence of a person who has understood something about themselves that they will never be able to unknow. Hercules sat in that silence for a long time. Then he stood up. That was all. He simply stood up. And that, in its own quiet way, was the bravest thing he ever did. Tiryns was a city built for permanence. Its walls were made from stones so large that later Greeks, looking at them and trying to understand how human hands could have moved such things, decided that human hands could not have, and attributed the construction to the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of an earlier age. The walls of Tiryns were called Cyclopean, and the name stuck, because there was something about looking at them that made the ordinary scale of human effort seem insufficient as an explanation. Inside those walls lived Eurystheus, king of Mycenae and Tiryns, ruler of the most powerful kingdom in Greece, a man who had come to his throne by the narrowest and most contingent of margins, and who had never, in all the years since, entirely stopped knowing it. Here is the background that matters. Zeus, on the day that Hercules was to be born, had made an announcement to the assembled gods. The next descendant of Perseus to be born would rule over all the surrounding lands. He meant Hercules. He was arranging the world to honor his son. Hera acted immediately. She delayed the birth of Hercules by several hours and accelerated the birth of Eurystheus, who was also a descendant of Perseus and who arrived into the world prematurely. Small and unimpressive, clutching a destiny that had been engineered away from someone else. Eurystheus knew this story. Everyone knew this story. He had spent his entire reign aware that the throne under him had originally been pointed at a different person, that he was occupying a position that the architecture of fate had not designed for him. And now that person was walking up the road toward Tiryns, carrying a lion skin and a club, and the particular posture of someone who has nothing left to lose. It is worth spending a moment with how Eurystheus actually felt about this, because the ancient sources often play him purely for comedy. The cowardly king hiding from the hero, and there is genuine comedy in it. But underneath the comedy is something more interesting. Eurystheus was not simply a coward. He was a man who had built his identity around a position he had never fully believed he deserved. And now the person who should have had that position was standing at his gates, sent by the gods themselves to serve him. The power dynamic was completely inverted from what it looked like on the surface. Yes, Eurystheus was the king. Yes, Hercules was technically his servant, but every person in that kingdom understood that if Hercules decided to stop being a servant, there was nothing in Tiryns that could stop him. So, Eurystheus designed the labors with that understanding in mind. He was not trying to challenge Hercules. He was trying to kill him. Each task was chosen for its apparent impossibility, for the high probability that it would end in the death of the person sent to perform it. The Nemean lion was unkillable by conventional means. The Hydra was a creature specifically designed by Hera to be lethal. The subsequent tasks escalated in difficulty in a careful progression that only makes sense if you understand that Eurystheus was not issuing challenges. He was issuing death sentences, one after another, and growing increasingly unsettled each time Hercules walked back through the gates alive. The first meeting between them is one of the great understated moments in all of Greek mythology. Hercules arrived at Tiryns. He was shown in. He stood before Eurystheus in the great hall of the palace. This enormous, lion-skinned figure, filling the room in a way that made everyone else in it seem slightly smaller. And he waited to hear what the king required of him. Eurystheus looked at him. And then Eurystheus, king of Mycenae and Tiryns, ruler of the most powerful kingdom in Greece, got up from his throne and went and hid in a large bronze jar. The sources describe it as an earthen jar in some versions and bronze in others, but they agree on the essential fact, which is that it was a container large enough to fit an adult man, that Eurystheus had it installed in the palace specifically for this purpose, and that he retreated to it whenever Hercules was in his direct vicinity and gave his instructions through a herald instead. Hercules received his orders through a messenger. The most powerful hero in the world stood in the throne room of Tiryns, getting his assignments from an intermediary, while the king crouched in a jar on the other side of the wall. This detail is not incidental. The labors were not just physically dangerous. They were designed to be degrading. He was performing impossible feats of strength and courage and endurance on the instructions of a man who was too frightened of him to share the same room. The achievement and the humiliation were inseparable, built into the same structure, and Hercules accepted this arrangement without complaint. There is something important in that acceptance. It would have been easy, and in some ways entirely justifiable, for Hercules to look at Eurystheus cowering in his jar and decide that this was not a legitimate authority deserving of his service. He was stronger, more capable, more genuinely heroic in every measurable sense than the man issuing his orders. The hierarchy between them was an accident of birth timing engineered by a goddess for her own purposes. But the oracle had sent him here. And Hercules had not come to Delphi to find an arrangement that was fair. He had come to find a path through what he had done and what he had become. The fairness of the arrangement was not the point. The point was the doing of it. The sustained, unglamorous, daily practice of showing up and completing what was required, and not using his power to rewrite the rules in his favor, even when every muscle in his body could have done exactly that. This is not a small thing. It is one of the most genuinely difficult things a person capable of taking what they want can do. To choose not to take it, and to keep not taking it, day after day. For years, he stood in the throne room and received his first assignment through the king's herald, the Nemean lion. There was a lion in the valley of Nemea, between Tiryns and Corinth, that had been making the surrounding region uninhabitable. The villages near Nemea had been emptying for months. People were leaving their homes, their fields, their ordinary lives, moving away from a threat that nothing had been able to stop. Hunters had gone into the valley and not come back. Soldiers had been sent, and the soldiers had not returned either. The lion was a creature of divine origin, the offspring of Typhon and Echidna, the two great monster parents of the Greek world, raised to a scale and a ferocity that went beyond anything in the natural order. Its hide could not be penetrated by any weapon made by human hands. It moved through the valley of Nemea like a force of nature, unhurried and unkillable, and the land around it was going quiet, in the way that land goes quiet when something has been living in it that nothing else can survive alongside. Hercules received this assignment and walked out of Tiryns toward Nemea. He did not appear particularly concerned. He accepted the arrangement without argument. Some people have interpreted this as submission. Others have called it humility. But perhaps it was something simpler. A man who had decided that the shape of his punishment mattered less than the fact of it. He was here to serve. He would serve. The valley of Nemea was quiet in the way that places become quiet when something has been wrong with them for a long time. It was not the quiet of wilderness, the productive silence of a place full of life going about its business without human interruption. It was the other kind, the quiet of absence, of things that had been there and were no longer. The boner that should have been moving through the tree line were not there. The small animals that ordinarily populated the margins of a valley, the rabbits and foxes and creatures that rustled in the grass at the edge of your vision, were gone. The farms that should have showed signs of recent occupation, smoke from cooking fires, the sound of livestock, the ordinary evidence of people living their lives, were empty and beginning to look like they had been empty for a while. The soil along the path was pale limestone dust, dry, even in the shadows, and the tracks in it told the story of a valley that had been clearing out over months. Human footprints heading away toward the roads that led elsewhere, animal tracks that stopped at the tree line and turned back, the absence of smaller predators, foxes and weasels, that would normally work the margins of farmland. Hercules walked through all of this and paid attention to it. He had spent enough time on mountains and in wilderness to understand what an absence of ordinary wildlife meant. Something in this valley had pushed every other living thing to a perimeter, had established itself so thoroughly as the dominant presence that nothing else was comfortable remaining within its range. He was walking toward the center of that range, and the silence was deepening as he went. He found the lion's tracks near a riverbed, where the soil was soft enough to hold impressions. They were large in the way that made you understand, without any other information, that the ordinary categories you used for thinking about dangerous animals did not apply here. This was not a lion that was bigger than average. This was something operating at a different scale entirely, something that had been made rather than evolved, for a specific purpose. He followed the tracks toward the higher ground, where a series of limestone caves opened into the hillside above the valley floor. The lion had two entrances to its den, 2 ways in, 2 ways out. An ambush in the conventional sense was not going to work. He tried the conventional approach first anyway, because it was the right thing to try. He stood at a distance and sent arrows toward the lion when it appeared at the cave entrance. Well-made arrows, with good fletching, drawn from a powerful bow with the full strength of his arm behind them. The arrows hit. He could see them hit, and they fell away from the lion's hide like rain off stone, without leaving any mark, without causing any visible reaction from the animal itself, which regarded him from the cave entrance with an expression that, if it had been on a human face, you would have called contemptuous. He tried his sword. The blade turned without penetrating. He tried his spear. The spear point bent. This was useful information. The problem could not be solved from a distance, and could not be solved with tools, and was therefore going to require him to enter the space the lion occupied and solve it with his body. There was no clever workaround available. There was only the narrow darkness of the cave and whatever happened when he went into it. He sealed one entrance. He drove brush and stone into the secondary opening until he was satisfied it was blocked adequately. Then he went into the primary entrance, into the dark, without a weapon. The space was tight. There was very little room to maneuver, which was a disadvantage in some ways and an advantage in others, because it meant the lion also could not use its speed and agility to stay out of reach. In the dark, in a space where neither of them could see well, the confrontation came down to something very simple. Hercules got his arms around the lion's neck and did not let go. The lion fought with everything it had, which was considerable, but Hercules held on through the full force of it, in the dark, in the narrow cave, until the fighting stopped. He came out into the late afternoon light of Nemea. He was bleeding from cuts on his arms and face. He was breathing hard. The lion was with him, but it was no longer a threat. He sat down on the ground outside the cave entrance and stayed there for a while, just breathing, letting his body understand that the immediate danger was finished. The light was coming low and golden across the valley floor, the long shadows of late day stretching from the tree line toward the empty farms. A hawk moved in a slow circle overhead, the first bird he had seen since entering the valley. Then he looked at the lion. He understood that no weapon had touched it. He reached for one of the creature's own claws, still sharp, still capable, and used it to remove the hide. He put the hide on. It settled across his shoulders and back with a weight that felt different from a garment, more like an addition, more like a layer of something that had been missing. He would wear it for the rest of his life. At festivals, at the beginning of battles, walking through cities and across the wild country between them. The lion skin was what people saw first when they saw Hercules. It became so associated with him that later generations could not picture him without it. Some called it a trophy. Some called it armor, practical protection that the impenetrable hide genuinely provided. Both of these things were true, but there was something else in it. When you kill something and wear it, you are doing more than displaying evidence of a victory. You are entering into a different relationship with the thing you killed. You are carrying it with you. It moves with you, responds to your breathing, becomes part of the daily physical fact of your existence. Every monster Hercules killed would leave something on him, not always as literally as this, but the accumulation of the things he had faced and defeated and survived would, over time, build something around him that was not entirely distinguishable from the things themselves. The man who hunts monsters for long enough eventually takes on some of the quality of the hunted. He walked back to Tiryns. He reported his completion of the task to the herald, who disappeared to consult with Eurystheus, who was presumably in or near his jar. The task was acknowledged. The next task was assigned. He walked back out of Tiryns. He wore the lion's skin for the rest of his life. It kept him warm on cold nights, and it frightened enemies before a single word was spoken. But sometimes, walking alone on the road to the next labor, he would catch his own reflection in still water and pause for just a moment, not quite recognizing the figure looking back. South of Tyrins, where the land flattened out toward the coast and the soil turned from dry limestone to something darker and wetter, there was a place called Lerna. Lerna had a reputation that preceded it by some distance. The ancient world regarded it as one of those locations where the boundary between the ordinary earth and whatever lay beneath the ordinary earth was thinner than it should be. There were springs at Lerna that were said to be bottomless, openings in the ground through which the underworld breathed upward into the living world. The water that came out of those springs was cold in a way that cold water usually is not. Cold in a way that felt intentional, and the vegetation around them was the particular lush, dense, slightly wrong green of plants growing in conditions that are very good for plants and not very good for much else. The marshes that spread out from the springs were old, older than the settlements around them, older than the roads that had been built to avoid them. They had a quality of permanence that the human constructions nearby did not have, and walking through them gave you the distinct impression that they were tolerating your presence rather than accommodating it. The Hydra lived in these marshes. Hera had raised it specifically for this purpose. The Hydra was not a wild animal in any ordinary sense. It was a designed threat, built with a specific person in mind, engineered with a feature that made it particularly suited to defeating someone who solved problems with overwhelming force. You could not kill it by attacking it directly. Every head you removed produced 2 more. The more aggressively you engaged with it, the larger it became. It was a trap disguised as a monster, and the trap was built around the assumption that Hercules would do what Hercules always did, which was to meet force with greater force and overwhelm whatever was in front of him. Hercules came to Lerna with Iolaus. Iolaus was his nephew, the son of Iphicles, and he had been following Hercules around since he was old enough to follow anyone anywhere. He was not physically extraordinary, not the recipient of divine parentage or supernatural capability. He was a young man who was loyal and observant and quick-thinking, who understood his role in this partnership was not to match Hercules blow for blow, but to be the other kind of useful, the kind that thinks while the other person is occupied with the immediate problem. They approached the marshes in the early morning when the mist was still sitting on the water, the surface of the marsh flat and silver in the grey light, the reeds along the edges, motionless in the still air. The smell of it was deep and vegetal and cold, the smell of water that has not moved in a very long time. Their feet sank slightly, with each step, on the soft ground near the water's edge, the earth giving in a way that reminded you it was not entirely solid. Hercules drove the Hydra out of its lair with burning arrows, which got it into the open where he could engage with it. And then the problem presented itself. He cut. 2 heads grew back. He cut those. 4 grew back. He cut those. 8 grew back. The mathematics of it were working against him in a direction that had only one destination. He kept cutting, because in the moment of fighting, with the creature in front of him, and Iolaus somewhere behind him, and the cold marsh water around his knees and the smell of the place filling everything, the option of stopping and thinking was not as available as it sounds from the outside. The Hydra was not giving him a pause in which to reconsider his approach. It was simply continuing to be the Hydra, which meant continuing to grow, continuing to press forward, continuing to be a problem that was getting larger the more he tried to solve it. Iolaus was the one who found the answer. He had been watching, which was what he was there for, and he had noticed something Hercules in the middle of the fight could not easily see. The necks, after the heads were removed, were trying to regenerate. The regeneration was coming from the open wound. If the wound was closed before the regrowth could begin, there was nothing for the new heads to grow from. He took a torch to the nearest fire and came back with it. The system they worked out was not elegant. It required close coordination in bad conditions, with a creature that was actively trying to kill both of them, in a marsh that wanted no one to be comfortable or sure-footed. Hercules cut, Iolaus cauterized. They moved through the Hydra's heads one by one with this method, each of them depending on the other in a way that neither could have managed alone. There was one head that could not be killed at all, the central head, the immortal one. Hercules could not destroy it. He buried it instead, pressing it under a great stone in the marsh, sealing it away where it could not regenerate and could not threaten, where it could do nothing except exist in permanent containment under the weight of the rock above it. The Hydra was finished. Hercules stood in the marsh and looked at what remained. He was covered in the creature's blood and ichor, which was corrosive in the way that things of divine origin sometimes are. His arms were burning. The marsh was quiet around him in the particular way that places go quiet after something definitive has happened in them. He did something then that the story records almost as an aside, a detail that gets mentioned briefly and then left behind as the narrative moves forward. But it is not a minor detail. It is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential things he did in his entire life. He took his arrows and dipped them in the Hydra's blood. The blood of the Hydra was poison of the most absolute kind. A wound from a weapon treated with it would not heal. There was no antidote available to the ancient world. A scratch was enough. The poison moved through the body with a patience that made it worse. Not fast enough to end things quickly. Slow enough to ensure that the person suffering it understood exactly what was happening and had time to understand that it was not going to stop. Hercules understood what he had made. He was not naive about it. He knew he was creating weapons of terrible lethality. And he accepted that. The world he moved through was genuinely dangerous, and the threats it presented were genuinely capable of killing him. Having an arrow that would end a fight decisively and permanently was a practical decision made by a practical man operating in a world where the things trying to kill you were often not killable by conventional means. He stored the arrows carefully. He kept them separate from his regular equipment. He handled them with the attention you give to something dangerous that is also valuable. He did not know, and could not have known, the path those arrows would eventually travel, the chain of events that would connect the moment of dipping them in that marsh to a night decades later on a different road entirely, with different people involved, with a logic of consequence so extended and so indirect that no one standing in the marsh that day could have traced the line from here to there. He could not have known. That is important to say clearly. What he did at Lerna was reasonable and defensible and made complete sense given everything he knew at the time. The arrows waited. There was one more complication from Lerna that arrived afterward. When Hercules returned to Tiryns and reported to Eurystheus through the usual intermediary, Eurystheus declined to count the Hydra among the completed labors. The reason he gave was that Iolaus had helped. The labor had not been performed alone, and therefore, by Eurystheus's interpretation of the terms, it did not count. Hercules received this ruling through the herald. He stood in the throne room for a moment. He accepted the ruling and walked back out of Tiryns to receive his next assignment. The Hydra had been the harder fight. It had required genuine ingenuity, genuine partnership, a solution that went beyond what Hercules alone could have managed, and it would not be counted. He did not argue. He walked out of the city and started down the road to the next thing. He stored the arrows carefully, wrapped in cloth, away from water and light. The most dangerous things often look like preparations. They wait. The third labor sent Hercules north, into the highlands of Arcadia, where the forests were old enough to have their own quality of silence, different from the silence of Nemea and different from the silence of Lerna, the silence of a place that had been undisturbed for long enough. that it had stopped noticing whether anyone was paying attention. The Ceryneian hind was a deer, not a monster, not a creature of Typhon and Echidna, not a designed threat built to kill him. A deer, golden-antlered, bronze-hoofed, sacred to the goddess Artemis, and faster than anything else alive. Eurystheus wanted it captured and brought to Tiryns, unharmed. The unharmed part was the complication. Wounding it was out of the question, because it belonged to Artemis, and any harm done to it would constitute an offense against the goddess that would create problems far beyond the immediate labor. Killing it was obviously impossible given that requirement. The only option was to catch it alive and intact, which meant the only option was to be faster than it, or to be patient enough that speed stopped being the deciding factor. Hercules was not faster than it. He discovered this within the first hour of pursuit, when the hind moved through a mountain forest with a liquid ease that made his own considerable speed seem effortful and approximate by comparison. It was not running from him in the panicked way of an animal in immediate fear. It was simply going where it wanted to go, at the pace it chose. And the pace it chose was one that kept a comfortable distance between them without ever quite disappearing. He followed it for a year. This fact deserves to sit for a moment, because it is easy to say and difficult to actually hold in the imagination. A year, 4 seasons, the hind moving through Arcadia and the northern forests and the cold upland valleys, and Hercules behind it, maintaining the pursuit through weather and terrain and the sheer accumulation of days that would have ended the effort for most people somewhere in the 2nd month. Autumn in those forests, the oak trees going amber and bronze, the mornings sharp with the first cold, the hind a flash of gold between the trees ahead of him, that was there, and then not there, and then visible again further along the ridge. Winter, and the snow in the high passes, the hind's bronze hooves leaving clean prints in the white that he followed through days when the light lasted only a few hours and the cold at night was absolute. Spring thaw, the sound of snow melt running in every small crease of the hillside. New grass, coming up, green, through the old. The hind moving again, with a lightness that the winter had not diminished. What kept him going was not the labor itself, or not only the labor. It was something in the nature of the pursuit that suited a part of him that the combat-oriented tasks did not reach. There was no violence available here. There was no moment of decisive confrontation to aim toward. There was only the continued act of following, of keeping the distance close enough that the connection between pursuer and pursued remained intact, of moving through the world at the rhythm that the world, in the form of this particular deer, was setting. He had spent years learning to fight. He had not spent very much time learning how to simply follow something and trust that the following was enough. By the time he finally caught the hind, near the river Ladon in winter, when the ground was frozen and the hind had paused to drink, the catch itself was almost secondary. He had it in his arms before it could bolt. It was calm, the way animals sometimes go calm when they understand that resistance has stopped being a productive option. Artemis appeared. The goddess of the hunt stood in the winter landscape and looked at Hercules holding her sacred animal and was not pleased. He explained the situation. He told her about Eurystheus, about the labors, about the oracle's instructions. He asked her permission to borrow the hind temporarily, to show it to Eurystheus and then release it. She allowed it. The hind was shown to Eurystheus and then released back to its own territory. The 3rd labor was counted. The 4th labor came from a different direction. Eurystheus wanted the Erymanthian boar, a creature of enormous size that had been devastating the countryside around Mount Erymanthos in Arcadia, brought back alive. On the way to Erymanthos, Hercules stopped to visit the centaur Pholus. Pholus was civilized and hospitable, genuinely pleased to have a visitor, and he opened his home to Hercules with real warmth. He also, at Hercules' request, opened a jar of wine that was communal property of all the centaurs, sacred and not meant to be opened for individual occasions. The smell of it traveled on the air in every direction. The other centaurs smelled it, came angry, came armed, and what had been a hospitable visit became a brawl with extreme speed. Hercules defended himself with the weapons he had. He used his Hydra poisoned arrows, because in a fight with multiple armed opponents, you use the weapons available to you. The centaurs scattered. Several were hit. Among those who suffered in the chaos was Chiron, the oldest and wisest of the centaurs, the teacher of heroes, the figure to whom the greatest men of the age had been sent as children to be educated. He was immortal, which meant the wound the poison opened in him was not going to end. It was simply going to continue, permanently, with no possibility of relief, because the body it was in could not die, and the poison in it could not be removed. Chiron eventually found a way out. Through a complex arrangement involving Prometheus, he was able to give up his immortality, to exchange his deathlessness for the death that the poison was demanding. He was able to die, and the dying ended what the poison had started. He was dead because of Hercules. Not because Hercules had wanted to harm him, not because there had been any malice in it, but because Hercules had been defending himself with the weapons he had, and the weapons he had were capable of this. The boar, after all of that, almost felt like an afterthought. Hercules drove it into deep snow on the upper slopes of Erymanthos, where its own mass and the depth of the drifts slowed it to the point where it could be bound and carried. He brought it back to Tyrins on his shoulder. Eurystheus saw the enormous and very alive and very agitated boar being carried through his gates and retreated to his jar. The fifth labor was the one that people sometimes use as evidence that Hercules was more than a fighter. Eurystheus sent him to clean the stables of Augeas, king of Elis, who owned the largest cattle herds in Greece and had not cleaned his stables in 30 years. The accumulation of waste from thousands of animals over 3 decades had reached a scale that was somewhere between an agricultural problem and a geological event. The stables were enormous. Eurystheus gave him a single day. The expectation was simple arithmetic. The work was too large for one person in one day. Hercules looked at the landscape around the stables, at the rivers Alpheus and Peneus running nearby, at the way the ground lay between the water and the buildings, and he made a different kind of calculation. He diverted both rivers. He redirected their courses to run directly through the stables, letting the force of the water do in hours what no amount of manual labor could accomplish in the time available. He then made the mistake of asking Augeas for the payment he had promised in exchange for the work. Augeas refused to pay. He argued that the rivers had done the work and Hercules had merely pointed them. The payment had been for Hercules' labor, not for the labor of rivers. This argument was legally successful. Eurystheus then used the payment dispute as grounds for refusing to count the labor. Hercules had expected personal compensation, and therefore the service had not been purely in fulfillment of the divine requirement. 2 labors now removed from the total. The Hydra not counted because of Iolaus. The stables not counted because of the payment dispute. By Eurystheus's revised accounting, more labors remained than should have. Hercules received this news and walked out of Tyrins. The road went in several directions from the gates of the city. He had been down most of them now. He took the one that pointed toward the next thing, whatever it was, and he walked. 3 labors, 3 different kinds of difficulty. The hind taught him that some things can only be caught by following, not chasing. The boar taught him, again, that his weapons had a way of finding people he cared about. And the stables taught him what anyone who has ever tried to clean up a genuine disaster already knows. The work is thankless. The rules keep changing. And the only thing you can control is whether you keep going. The sixth labor took Hercules to a marsh in Arcadia called Stymphalos, and the problem there was birds. This sounds, on the surface, considerably less dramatic than a lair full of serpents or a regenerating nine-headed monster in a poisonous marsh. Birds. The word does not carry the weight of the other things he had faced, does not arrive with the same quality of menace that lion or Hydra produces in the imagination. But the Stymphalian birds were not ordinary birds in any sense that the word ordinary can bear. They were large enough to be a genuine physical threat. Their feathers were made of bronze, catching the light in the way that living things are not supposed to catch light. And they could launch those feathers as projectiles with a force and precision that made them effective weapons at distance. Their beaks and claws were the same material. The marsh they occupied had become, over time, another of those locations where ordinary life had simply ceased to be sustainable, where the accumulation of damage from their presence had pushed everything else to the margins. The approach problem was immediate. The marsh itself was unreliable underfoot, too soft to support the weight of a person moving through it with any speed or confidence, not solid enough to fight from. Getting close enough to engage with the birds directly was going to require either crossing ground that would not hold him or finding another way to get them where he could reach them. Athena came to him at the edge of the marsh. She brought him a pair of bronze crotala, noisemakers made by Hephaestus in his forge, instruments designed to produce a sound of sufficient volume and strangeness to disturb creatures accustomed to occupying their environment without challenge. He climbed to the high ground above the marsh and used them. The sound they produced was considerable, and it worked. The birds rose from the marsh in a mass response to the disturbance, lifting into the air in a cloud of metallic wings, bringing them into a position where they could be reached. From the high ground, with his bow, Hercules began shooting. He could not kill all of them. There were too many, and some portion of any flock in flight will always escape the range of a single archer. But he killed enough that the survivors made whatever calculation birds make about whether a location is worth remaining in, and departed. The marsh at Stymphalos quieted. The birds did not return. Eurystheus counted it. The labor was done. The seventh labor sent him to Crete. King Minos had a bull that had originally come from Poseidon, sent as part of an arrangement between the god and the king, an arrangement that had gone sideways in the way that arrangements with gods tend to go sideways. The bull had been magnificent when it arrived. By the time Hercules reached Crete, it had been running loose across the island for some time, causing the kind of widespread destruction that a divinely sourced bull of enormous size can cause when there is no longer anyone capable of controlling it. Minos was pleased to have Hercules take it away. The capture went more smoothly than most of the labors had gone. Hercules approached the bull the way he had learned, in the years on the mountain and in the years since, to approach large and dangerous animals that were, nevertheless, animals, with patience and attention to the creature's own signals rather than simply with force. The bull was powerful, but it was not supernatural in the way the Hydra had been supernatural, not designed with a specific trap built into its nature. He subdued it. He brought it back to Tyrins across the water. Eurystheus looked at the bull, went to his jar, and then instructed his herald to release the animal. He had no particular use for a divine bull in his kingdom, and had wanted it brought back as proof of completion rather than as a possession. The bull was set loose near Marathon. It would remain a problem for the people of the region for some time afterward. Hercules had completed the task as specified. What happened after the task was completed was not, apparently, his responsibility. He walked away from it and started north for the eighth labor. King Diomedes of Thrace kept horses. The mares of Diomedes were famous throughout Greece, in the way that things become famous when the information about them is both extraordinary and reliable, passed from traveler to traveler, with the particular emphasis people give to warnings about places they have survived. The horses were large, They were fast, and they were fed on human flesh. This was not a metaphor. Diomedes maintained his mares on a diet of the people who arrived in his kingdom and did not leave it. He was a son of Ares, which in the mythology is a designation that tends to come with a specific quality of unchecked brutality. And he had built a system around his horses that served both their appetites and his own indifference to the lives of people weaker than himself. Hercules came to Thrace with a group of companions. Among them was Abderus. The sources describe him as young, as someone Hercules was fond of in the close way that the ancient world used that word, which carried warmth and loyalty and the particular bond that forms between people who have faced difficult things together. He was not a fighter of the first rank. He was not there to match Hercules in combat. He was there because he wanted to be there, and because Hercules wanted him there. Hercules attacked Diomedes directly, because there was no diplomatic solution available with a man who fed his guests to his horses. He dealt with Diomedes and the guards who fought alongside him, and in the midst of that fight, in the way that large and complex fights generate subsidiary problems that require immediate management, he gave Abderus the task of holding the horses. He did not think through, in that moment, what holding the horses meant in practical terms. He was occupied with Diomedes. Abderus took the reins, because Hercules needed someone to take the reins, because the fight required his full attention, and there was no other option available to him in the immediate moment. The horses killed Abderus. They did what horses fed on human flesh do when left with a person of ordinary human strength and no particular means of controlling them. When Hercules turned from the fight and understood what had happened, the ancient sources record that he dealt with the remaining situation efficiently and without visible expression. He fed Diomedes to his own horses, which had a quality of justice to it that the ancient world appreciated. He brought the now considerably calmer animals back to Tiryns as the labor required. He built a city afterward on the site in Thrace where Abderus had died. He named it Abdera. The naming of cities after the dead is one of the ways that people in the ancient world managed the weight of loss, made the private and unbearable fact of a person's absence into something visible and permanent. Abdera existed on maps. Travelers passed through it. The name was spoken in ordinary conversation about roads and distances and the geography of northern Greece. Abderus would not be the last person whose absence Hercules marked this way. He had enough experience by now to know that he had learned, though he had not chosen to learn it, that the people around him were not as durable as the things he was sent against. The monsters absorbed the impact of him. The people he cared about did not. He built a city and gave it a dead friend's name. It seemed like the right thing to do. He would do it again. Later. For others, there were enough cities to name. There were always enough people gone. The ninth labor required Hercules to travel to the far edge of the Greek world's imagination. The Amazons lived in a territory that existed for the ancient Greeks, somewhere between geography and myth. A place they could point to on a map, but that retained, even with a location attached to it, the quality of somewhere fundamentally different from the ordinary places people actually inhabited. They were placed variously near the Black Sea, in regions genuinely distant from the Greek mainland, far enough away that the stories about them could circulate without being easily checked against the reality. What the stories agreed on was this: the Amazons were a society of women warriors, organized, capable, and governed by queens rather than kings. They were exceptional fighters. They had their own customs, their own religion, their own relationship to the lands they occupied. They were not dependent on the Greek world for their legitimacy or their self-understanding. Their queen was Hippolyta, and she wore a golden war belt, a gift from her father, Ares, the god of war. It was this belt that Eurystheus wanted. His daughter had expressed a desire for it, and Eurystheus had translated his daughter's desire into a labor for his captive hero. The justification was thin, and the purpose was trivial. A powerful and sacred object taken from the queen of a warrior civilization, so that a king's daughter could have it as a decorative piece. If the labors had a moment of pure pettiness, this was close to it. Hercules sailed to the Black Sea with a company of men. Among them, Theseus. A genuine expedition, rather than a solo labor. The scale of the undertaking reflecting a realistic assessment of what entering Amazon territory would require. What happened when they arrived was not what any of them expected. Hippolyta came to the ships. She came without an army, without a formal delegation, without the apparatus of official reception that you would expect when a queen meets a foreign force that has arrived in her territory. She came, the sources suggest, with genuine curiosity about the man she had heard stories of, perhaps a recognition that the situation called for something other than automatic hostility. She spoke to Hercules. They talked about the labor, about what he had come for, about the belt and the reasons behind the request. Hippolyta listened. She considered what he told her, and she agreed to give him the belt without a fight. Moved by the context of his situation, or simply by her own judgment that a direct conflict over this particular object was not worth the cost. This was going to be the labor that did not require violence. The labor that ended not in a creature's death or a capture, but in two people having a conversation and arriving at a resolution that worked for both of them. There was something in that possibility that mattered. A proof that not every problem in this world had to be solved by force. Hera decided this was not acceptable. She moved through the Amazon camp in disguise, wearing the face of an ordinary Amazon warrior. Moving from group to group with a piece of information she had manufactured for the occasion, Hercules and his men were there to kidnap the queen. They were not negotiating in good faith. The conversation at the ships was a distraction while his men positioned themselves to take Hippolyta by force. None of this was true. All of it was effective. The Amazons heard this and responded the way warriors respond to the news that their queen is in danger. Immediately, and without the time for verification that might have revealed the information as false, they came to the ships armed and moving fast. And the situation went from a conversation on a beach to a battle in the time it takes for a decision to travel from a leader to the people who carry it out. Hippolyta died in the fighting that followed, in the confusion of a battle that neither she nor Hercules had wanted, in the chaos that Hera had engineered from nothing. The woman who had been willing to simply hand over the belt and let everyone go home was gone. He left the Amazon territory with the belt. He had what the labor required. He sailed back toward Greece with the evidence of completion and the knowledge of what had been possible before it stopped being possible. The belt changed hands without ceremony. The labor was counted. But the image of that day, at the ships, stayed with him. Two people in a conversation finding their way to an agreement. The violence entirely avoidable. The belt changing hands without anyone being hurt. That version of events had been real, had existed as an actual possibility, had been in the process of occurring when something outside of both of them reached in and ended it. Hercules had faced monsters that were trying to kill him. He had faced environments designed to destroy him. He had faced tasks built to be impossible. He had not, until now, fully encountered the specific grief of things that were going right, being prevented from going right by forces that had nothing to do with his choices or his failures. You can prepare for a lot of things. You cannot really prepare for that. There is a specific kind of grief for the things that almost were. Hercules carried a lot of that kind. Most heroes do, if you look closely enough. There is a point in every long journey where the familiar world falls away. Not all at once. It happens gradually, the way daylight fades. Slowly enough that you do not notice any single moment of change, but definitively enough that when you stop and look around, you understand that the place you are standing is genuinely different from the place you started. The roads become less maintained. The settlements become smaller and farther apart. The people you meet speak with accents that require more attention to understand, and then with languages that require an interpreter. And then eventually there are no people at all. Only the land itself and whatever the land contains. Hercules had been walking toward this kind of edge for years. Each labor had taken him a little farther from the center of the Greek world, a little deeper into the territories where the ordinary rules of civilization became suggestions rather than structures. But the 10th labor, the one that sent him after the cattle of Geryon, took him beyond anything the previous 9 had required. Geryon lived on an island called Erythea, which the ancient world placed somewhere beyond the western horizon, past the point where the Mediterranean opened into the great outer ocean that the Greeks believed surrounded the entire known world. To get there, Hercules would have to travel the full length of the Mediterranean from east to west, cross Libya, reach the place where the land narrowed to a passage between 2 continents, and then go beyond even that. He walked. The journey took months, and the ancient sources preserve fragments of it, encounters and incidents along the way that give the expedition a texture it would not have if we only knew the beginning and the end. He traveled through regions the Greek world knew about but had not fully mapped, places where the stories about what lived there were more reliable than the geography, where a traveler operated on the basis of accumulated mythology rather than first-hand knowledge. The landscape through Libya was vast and pale and indifferent, a world of distances too large for the eye to fully process. The horizon, always the same distance away regardless of how far you walked toward it. The heat there was the dry, serious heat of a place that has no interest in moderating itself for the comfort of travelers. The shadows of large rocks at midday were the only shade available, small rectangles of relief on the pale ground, and you learned to move from one to the next, the way a sailor moves from landmark to landmark across open water. In that landscape he encountered Antaeus, a giant who drew his strength from the earth itself and who had been killing travelers through his territory with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for a long time. The key to defeating him was understanding where his strength came from. Hercules lifted him into the air, removing the source of his power, and held him there until the fight was finished. A problem solved not by overwhelming force, but by understanding the nature of the problem first. He reached the place the Greeks called the Pillars, the narrow strait where the Mediterranean met the ocean beyond it. The land on the left was Europe. The land on the right was Africa. Between them was a passage of water that felt, to anyone standing at its edge, like a threshold, the kind of physical place that also functions as a conceptual boundary, the edge of the organized world and the beginning of whatever lay beyond it. The water in the strait moved with a purpose that the Mediterranean proper did not move with, a directional pull that you could feel on the hull of a boat and in the behavior of the surface, the outer ocean drawing the inland sea through this narrow passage with a patience that had been operating since before anyone was there to notice it. He set 2 pillars there, at the place where the known world ended, at the narrowing between 2 continents. He erected markers that would outlast him by centuries. The Greeks called them the Pillars of Hercules, and sailors who passed through that strait for generations afterward felt something when they went by them. Not quite awe, not quite warning, something in between. The feeling of a boundary that a man had walked through and marked on his way back, so that everyone who came after would know that someone had been beyond this point and had come home. He needed to cross the ocean to reach Erythea. The outer ocean was not the Mediterranean, not a body of water that Greek ships were designed to navigate, and the problem of crossing it was genuine rather than rhetorical. He asked Helios. The god of the sun traveled across the sky each day in a great golden vessel, and at the end of each day descended into the ocean and traveled back to his starting point through the waters beneath the world. He had a golden cup, enormous, that he used for this return journey. Hercules asked to borrow it. This required a confidence that shades into what less charitable observers might call audacity. You do not simply ask the god of the sun for his transportation vessel. There is no established protocol for this. There is no precedent that makes it a reasonable thing to expect. Helios agreed. The sources suggest he found the request, or possibly the person making it. Sufficiently remarkable, that refusal seemed like the less interesting option. Hercules crossed the outer ocean in the sun's golden cup, rocking on waters that no Greek ship had navigated, under a sky that looked different from this side of the pillars, arriving eventually at Erythea as the sun continued its underwater return. The island was red, in the way that islands are sometimes red when the soil has a particular mineral content and the light comes from a particular angle. Late afternoon light, the shadows long and deeply colored, the cattle of Geryon grazing on a hillside that glowed with the particular warm orange of that hour, their hides the same deep red as the earth beneath them, so that from a distance they seemed less like animals grazing on a hillside and more like something that had grown out of it. Geryon was extraordinary in the way the ancient world described him. 3 bodies joined, 3 sets of arms, 3 heads, a single consciousness operating through a form that gave him angles of attack and defense that a single-bodied opponent had no natural framework for countering. He was a warrior of genuine capability, not mindless, not without strategy. His herdsman came first, with a 2-headed dog named Orthrus who was kin to Cerberus. Both fell before Geryon arrived. Then Geryon came across the island to defend what was his. 3 shields raised, 3 spears in hand, the light throwing multiple shadows of all of them across the red ground. Hercules had been fighting things of extraordinary capability for years by this point. He had developed through the accumulated experience of the labors a quality of adaptability that the early version of himself, the one who had arrived at the Hydra expecting to overwhelm it with force, had not possessed. He found the angles available to him, used the distance his arrows provided, closed where the terrain allowed it. Geryon fell. The cattle needed to travel from Erythea to the Greek mainland, which was the full length of the world away. Hercules began walking them home. The return journey became one of the longest continuous episodes in the mythology of his life. A journey that took him back through the pillars and across the Mediterranean, and through territories that presented their own complications. Cattle, being the kind of cargo that attracts attention and requires constant management and periodically escapes in directions that require the journey to stop while the escapee is retrieved. He crossed into Italy, through a landscape that would one day become one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, though it was not that yet. Was only land with people on it, and hills and rivers and the same sky that covered everything else. A giant named Cacus stole some of the cattle while he slept. He dealt with Cacus and retrieved them. The people of the region, grateful for the removal of the giant, gave him hospitality and honors that were among the earliest forms of the worship that would eventually make him a god in the Roman world. He brought the cattle to Eurystheus. Eurystheus sacrificed them to Hera. The labor was counted. The cattle were gone. He had been to the edge of the world and back. He had seen the outer ocean and the red island and the sunset from beyond the pillars. He had walked through territories that existed for most Greeks only as names in stories, and he had found them to be real places with real ground and real weather and real people and real problems. The world was bigger than anyone who had not left the center of it understood. He had been far enough now to know this with a certainty that the people who waited in their cities could not share. He took the road back to Tiryns. He set the pillars at the edge of the world, and sailors who passed them for centuries afterward felt something when they went by. The feeling of a boundary that a man had walked through and marked on his way back, so that everyone who came after would know someone has been beyond this point. Someone went all the way to the edge and came home. The 11th labor sent him to the far west again. But this time, to a place that was less a geography than a state of being. The garden of the Hesperides existed at the edge of the world in the way that certain places exist, meaning that it was real in the ancient sources and located with genuine specificity and also fundamentally resistant to the ordinary logic of distance and travel. It was where the golden apple tree grew, the one that Hera had received as a wedding gift, tended by the daughters of Atlas and guarded by Ladon, a serpent of 100 heads that did not sleep and did not leave. Eurystheus wanted the apples. The first problem was that Hercules did not know how to get there. He needed to find someone who knew. He found Nereus first, the old man of the sea, a shape-shifting deity who possessed the kind of knowledge that comes from being very old and paying attention for a very long time. Getting information from Nereus required holding on to him while he changed shape continuously, becoming water and fire and various animals and other things that are difficult to maintain a grip on. Hercule held on. Eventually Nereus told him the direction. The road to the garden took him through the Caucasus Mountains, where he found something that stopped him and required a decision. Prometheus was there. Prometheus, who had given fire to humanity and been punished for it by Zeus with a sentence of the most carefully engineered suffering available to the divine imagination, chained to a rock, an eagle coming every day to eat his liver, the liver regenerating overnight so that the eagle could return the following morning and the thing could begin again. The sentence was eternal because Prometheus was immortal. It had been ongoing for a very long time by the time Hercules arrived. The Caucasus at that elevation was cold even in summer, the kind of cold that came from altitude and wind rather than season. The rock grey and bare and indifferent to everything that happened on it. The chain was old. The eagle came on its regular schedule, and Prometheus, who had been there long enough to know exactly what every day on that rock was going to contain, looked at the figure coming up the mountainside toward him with an expression that suggested he had not been expecting a visitor. Hercules killed the eagle. He broke the chains. He freed Prometheus. This was not a small action. Prometheus had been imprisoned by Zeus, and Zeus's decrees were not casually overturned by anyone, including Zeus's own children. Hercules was intervening in a divine punishment of indefinite duration on behalf of a Titan who had been judged and sentenced by the highest authority in the cosmos. He did it anyway. Zeus, in most versions of the story, allowed it, and Prometheus, now free, told Hercules what he needed to know about reaching the garden and how to get the apples once he arrived. Do not enter the garden yourself. Find Atlas. Ask him to get the apples. Hercules traveled on to where Atlas stood. Atlas was a Titan who had fought against the Olympians in the war that established the current divine order. He had lost, and his punishment was specific and physical and had been ongoing since the war ended. He stood at the edge of the world with the sky resting on his shoulders. The sky, the actual weight of the heavens, pressing down on him with everything it contained, requiring his constant effort to support, never allowing him to rest or put it down or do anything except stand there and hold it up. He had been doing this since before the cities existed, before the roads, before the people who built the roads and the cities. He had been standing in that position when there was nothing in the world yet except the world. Hercules asked him to go get the apples. In exchange, he offered to hold the sky while Atlas was gone. Atlas looked at the person making this offer. He had been holding the sky long enough to understand exactly what was being proposed, what it actually meant to take that weight onto your shoulders, what happened to your body and your mind when you were responsible for something that large and that constant with no relief available. He had also been standing there long enough that the prospect of putting it down, even temporarily, even under these specific circumstances, was more than he could easily refuse. He handed the sky to Hercules and left. and Hercules held up the sky. The sources describe this moment with a brevity that does not do it justice. He took the sky onto his shoulders. He stood in the position that Atlas had occupied since before human memory. He held it. What this actually felt like is something the ancient sources could only gesture at, because what they were pointing toward was not a physical sensation exactly, but a quality of bearing something that was not meant to be borne by one person, not meant to be a single person's responsibility, too large for any individual frame to carry, without the carrying becoming the entirety of what that person does and is. He stood there. He had held things before. He had grappled with the Nemean lion in a narrow cave and felt the full resistance of an unkillable animal using everything it had. He had stood in the Lernaean marsh with the Hydra regenerating while the cold water rose around his knees. He had carried the Erymanthian boar down a mountain on his shoulder through deep snow. This was different from all of those things. It was not simply heavier. It was different in kind, requiring a quality of sustained presence, of being present to something large and unrelenting, and simply continuing to be present to it without the option of resolution. He had felt something like this before, not physically, in the years after Thebes, in the long process of learning to carry what he had done and what he had lost. The sky felt like that. If that feeling had been given a physical form and placed on actual shoulders, Atlas came back with the apples. He also came back with a proposal. He would take the apples to Eurystheus himself. Hercules could keep holding the sky. Atlas had decided, in the time it took to walk to the garden and back, that the prospect of being permanently relieved of his burden was more attractive than the terms of the original arrangement. Thousands of years of holding the sky produces a perspective on freedom that is difficult for anyone who has not held the sky to fully appreciate. The opportunity had presented itself and he took it. Hercules agreed. He said that was fine. He would continue holding the sky. But could Atlas just take it back for a moment while he found something to put on his shoulders to cushion the weight for the long term? Hercules picked up the apples and walked. It is one of the few moments in the labors where Hercules wins entirely by thinking, where the physical capability is irrelevant, and the victory comes from seeing the shape of the situation clearly and moving through it before the other party had time to reconsider. Atlas was stronger in this particular context. Atlas had experience. Atlas had a perfectly good reason for doing what he tried to do. Hercules simply understood the situation faster and moved. He brought the apples to Eurystheus. They eventually made their way back to Athena, who returned them to the garden. Because objects of that kind belong where they were made, and not in someone's treasure room in Tyrins. The labor was counted. One remained. For a few hours, or possibly longer, Hercules held up the sky. Not because it was glorious, not because he chose to, because there was no one else. And the alternative was letting it fall. He had spent his life like that, carrying things that should never have been his to carry, standing under weight that was never meant for one person, and always, somehow, finding a way to set it down gently enough that the world did not notice how close it had come to breaking. The 12th labor was the one that Eurystheus had saved for last, which tells you something about how Eurystheus thought about Hercules and about the purpose the labors were meant to serve. He had sent him to fight unkillable lions and regenerating monsters and divine cattle and the edge of the known world. And each time Hercules had come back. And each time Eurystheus had retreated to his jar and thought about what to send him to next. The last one was simple in its statement and impossible in its implication. Go to the underworld. Bring back Cerberus. Cerberus was the guardian of the gates of the dead, the three-headed dog that stood at the boundary between the living world and the realm of Hades, whose function was to ensure that the dead stayed dead and that the living stayed on their own side of the boundary. He was enormous, and he was effective, and the entire cosmological order of the ancient world depended in some practical sense on his continued presence at his post. Eurystheus wanted him brought to Tiryns, temporarily, as proof, as the final demonstration that there was nothing Hercules could not be sent after, no limit to what the labor system could demand of him. What Eurystheus may not have fully considered was that getting Cerberus meant entering the underworld while alive, which was not something the architecture of the cosmos was designed to permit. The dead went down. They did not come back. The living stayed above. The boundary was maintained by Cerberus and by the rivers and by the weight of divine law that had organized reality since the earliest days of the current order. Hercules was going to have to cross that boundary in the wrong direction. He prepared carefully. He traveled to Eleusis, the sacred site near Athens where the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone were practiced, where initiates were admitted to rituals that promised a kind of knowledge about death that ordinary life did not provide. He was initiated into the mysteries. What he learned there the sources do not say, because the mysteries were called the mysteries for a reason, and the prohibition on discussing what happened inside them was absolute. But the initiation was apparently useful preparation for what he was about to attempt. He found the entrance to the underworld at a place called Tainarum, on the southern tip of the Peloponnese, where a cave opened into the earth and kept opening, past the point where caves normally stopped, down into the permanent dark beneath the living world. He went in. The descent was long, and the geography of the underworld was both specific and strange, organized according to a logic that was not quite the logic of the living world. The river Styx, black and cold, and carrying the weight of all the oaths sworn on its waters since the beginning of time. The smell of the place was deep and mineral, the smell of stone that has never been touched by sunlight, of water that has flowed underground since before the mountains above it were formed. The air was still in the way. That air is still when there is nothing to move it. No wind, no weather, no change of season, just the permanent, patient, dark, the asphodel meadows, where the ordinary dead wandered without particular suffering or particular joy, existing in the way that things exist, when existence has been reduced to its minimum. The Elysian fields in the distance, brighter than the rest, for those whose lives had earned that brighter destination. The sounds of the place were muted, not absent. Voices and movement at the edges of perception, the way a city sounds from far away when you cannot quite make out the individual words. Charon was at the river. The ferryman who transported the dead across the water looked at Hercules, the way that people look at things that do not belong in the place they are. A living person at the river of the dead was not a category that his professional experience had prepared him for. Hercules crossed. He moved through the underworld with attention and without unnecessary provocation. This was not a place for fighting. He was here for one specific thing, and he needed to navigate to it without creating more complications than the situation already contained. He encountered the dead. The shade of Meleager found him first. Or perhaps it was the other way around. The grey figures of that place drawn to the warmth of a living man the way cold things are drawn to heat. Meleager was a hero whose life had been connected to a piece of burning wood by the fates, who had died by his mother's hand when she chose vengeance over her son. He was recognizable, even in the diminished form that the dead take on in that place. The outline of who he had been, still visible in the way he stood and the way he spoke. He asked Hercules to look after his sister when he returned to the living world. Her name was Deianira. Hercules said he would. This moment is one of the quiet pivots of the entire narrative. A promise made to a shade in the underworld. The name of a woman spoken in the dark, beneath the living world. A connection established between Hercules and someone he had never met in a place neither of them would normally have any reason to be. The promise was made simply, without drama, the way you agree to pass along a message from someone who cannot deliver it themselves. He found Theseus, trapped in a chair that held anyone who sat in it. One of the complications that Theseus had encountered during his own ill-advised visit to the underworld some time before, Hercules pulled him free. The chair released him. He was not entirely intact afterward, but he was alive and able to make his own way back to the living world, which was considerably better than what he had been before Hercules arrived. He tried to free Pirithous as well, Theseus's companion who had also been trapped, but the ground shook when he attempted it. A seismic communication from Hades himself that this particular release was not going to be permitted. Pirithous had come to the underworld to try to take Persephone as a bride, which was the kind of plan that tends not to end well, and Hades's objection to his release was coherent and not something Hercules was in a position to override. He accepted this. There were limits here that were not the same as the limits in the living world, and recognizing them was part of what the underworld required of anyone navigating it with any intelligence. He found Hades. The Lord of the Dead received him. Hades was not a villain in the Greek conception, not evil in the way that the ruler of a realm of death might be expected to be evil in other traditions. He was a king doing his job, maintaining the order of his domain, presiding over the inevitable destination of all living things with a seriousness appropriate to the weight of the responsibility. He was, by most accounts, surprised to see Hercules there. Hercules explained what he needed and why. He asked permission to take Cerberus temporarily to fulfill the labor, with the understanding that the dog would be returned when the task was complete. Hades considered this. He agreed, with one condition. Hercules could take Cerberus if he could subdue him without weapons. The condition was not arbitrary. Weapons in the underworld would have been a violation of the order of things that Hades was not willing to permit. Hercules could use his strength, his physical capability, the qualities that were native to him. He could not use the tools that belonged to the living world's approach to violence. He found Cerberus at the gates. 3 heads, a man of serpent, a tail that was itself a serpent, eyes that had been looking at everything that arrived at those gates since the current order of the world was established, that had seen every variety of the dead that existence could produce. The dog did not seem particularly concerned by the living man approaching him. He had seen everything. A living man was unusual, but not the strangest thing those gates had received. Hercules did not reach for his club. He did not reach for an arrow. He approached the dog slowly, with the same attention he had brought to frightened animals on the mountain above Thebes, the same quality of managing his own energy before anything else, communicating through his body that he was not a threat before any other kind of communication was possible. What followed was not a fight in the sense that most of the labors had involved fights. Cerberus resisted. The serpents bit. The physical engagement was real, and Hercules felt it. But he did not respond with the overwhelming force that had characterized his approach to every other creature he had faced. He held on. He endured what the dog's resistance produced. He waited for the resistance to exhaust itself, the way that all resistance eventually exhausts itself when it is met not with counterforce but with patient, sustained presence. Cerberus came with him. He led the dog up from the underworld into the light of the living world, where Cerberus found the experience of daylight, which he had never encountered before, sufficiently unpleasant that he produced a foam from his mouths that fell to the ground and became, according to the ancient sources, the first aconite plant, poison growing from the discomfort of the guardian of the dead encountering the world he had always guarded against. He brought Cerberus to Tiryns. Eurystheus retreated to his jar with what the sources describe as particular haste. Hercules stood in the throne room with Cerberus and waited for the herald to emerge and acknowledge the completion of the labor. The herald emerged. The completion was acknowledged. Hercules walked back out of Tiryns and took Cerberus back to the underworld, returning him to his post at the gates as the arrangement had specified. Hades received the dog. The gates were, as they had been. The boundary between the living and the dead was restored to its normal condition. 12 labors, all of them, by the original count, 10 acknowledged by Eurystheus, 2 removed from the tally for reasons that had nothing to do with whether the work had been done. He stood outside the gates of Tiryns in the ordinary afternoon light and waited to feel whatever was supposed to come next. The sky was the same color it had always been. The road ran in both directions. His hands were the same hands they had always been. The lion skin was on his shoulders. The club was in his hand. He was free. The word had a shape and a weight that he turned over in his mind. The way you turn over something you have been looking forward to for a long time and find, when it finally arrives, that it is real and also not quite what you had imagined. He was free. The 12 years of service were over. Eurystheus had no further claim on him, and the thing that had been living in his chest since the morning in Thebes, the heavy and quiet thing that the labors had given him, something to do in the presence of but had not, in the end, resolved, was still there, exactly where he had left it, patient as the underworld. Freedom, it turned out, was not the same as healing. He was going to need some time to understand what that meant. He had done it. He had walked into death and come back. He was free, and yet standing outside the gates of Tiryns with the last labor behind him, the weight was still there. Freedom, it turned out, was not the same as healing. He would need some time to understand what that meant. Freedom is a strange thing to receive after a long time without it. Not unwelcome, not something you would trade back, having it now, for the certainty and structure of the time before it. But strange in the way that any significant change is strange. In the way that the end of something long and difficult leaves a space where the difficult thing used to be, and the space does not immediately fill with what you hoped would fill it. Hercules had been in service for 12 years. Not 12 easy years of routine tasks that left the mind free to wander toward what came next. 12 years of sustained, dangerous, frequently impossible effort, each labor consuming the full range of what he was capable of. Each one succeeded immediately by the next, the structure of the sentence creating a rhythm that was brutal, but also, in its own way, organizing. He had always known what the next thing was. There was always a next thing. Now there was no task. The road ran in every direction from the gates of Tiryns, and none of them had a destination assigned by anyone but himself. He was not, the sources make clear, a person who handled unstructured time gracefully. He was constitutionally oriented toward difficulty and challenge, and the concrete satisfactions of impossible things accomplished. He had been that way since childhood, since the mountain above Thebes where he had learned that his body needed something to be up against. The labors had, in their terrible way, been well suited to him. They had asked everything of him. They had consumed all the excess of capability and energy that in ordinary circumstances tended to spill over into damage. Without them, the excess had nowhere to go. He went to Calydon first, drawn there partly by direction and partly by a promise he had made in the underworld to a shade named Meleager, who had asked him to look after his sister. He had said he would. He was a man who kept his word, and this particular word had been given in the most serious place he had ever been, to a person who no longer had any way to hold him to it, except the fact that he had given it. But before Calydon, there was Iphitus. Iphitus was the son of Eurytus, of Oechalia, who had been Hercules' archery teacher in the years before the labors, whose family had been connected to his in the long history of a life spent moving through the world and accumulating connections. Iphitus came to Hercules because his father's mares had gone missing, and he was trying to find them. Following the trail of their absence from person to person, the sources differ on the exact circumstances of what happened next. What they agree on is the outcome. Hercules. in a rage that came on suddenly and ended quickly, and left him standing in the same position he had stood in before. Iphitus was gone. He was standing in the same place he had stood before. The same gap between intention and action. The same silence after the irreversible thing. The pattern had not been broken by 12 years of labor. The sentence had ended. The pattern remained. He went to Delphi. The oracle told him he needed to be sold into slavery for 3 years, with the proceeds given as compensation for the death of Iphitus. He accepted it. The person who bought him was Omphale, queen of Lydia. Lydia was in Asia Minor, a kingdom of considerable wealth and sophistication, whose culture overlapped with the Greek world in some ways and diverged from it in others. Omphale was a woman of intelligence and a quality of comfortable authority, someone who exercised power with the confidence of someone who did not need to perform it because she actually had it. He performed women's work. He spun thread. He wove cloth. He did the domestic labor of the household alongside the women servants. His enormous hands managing the delicate work of the loom with the focused attention he had once brought to identifying a lion's tracks or assessing the geography of a marsh. Omphale, meanwhile, wore his lion skin. She carried his club. She dressed herself in the markers of his identity and walked through her court with them. The ancient world found this episode comic and also unsettling, and the combination is worth sitting with. The humor came from the reversal of expected roles, from the incongruity of the strongest man in the world doing needlework while a woman wore his lion skin. The unease came from something the humor was trying to cover, which was the question that the reversal raised. If Hercules without his lion skin and his club was just a man doing domestic work, and a woman in his lion skin with his club projected a kind of authority, what did that say about the things that had always seemed to inhere in the man himself? He did the work without complaint. He was not degraded by it in the way the humor expected. He performed the tasks assigned to him with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, and he came out of the 3 years on the other side intact in a way that suggested the lion skin had never been the source of what he was. The qualities that made him Hercules were not the skin and the club. They were whatever had been underneath those things all along. Whatever had carried him through 12 years of impossible tasks, and the morning in Thebes, and the cave in Nemea, and the moment in the underworld when he held Cerberus by patience instead of force. Omphale freed him when the 3 years were done. They parted on terms that surprised everyone, including themselves, with a mutual respect that had developed through an unusual amount of time spent in close proximity to each other's reality. He walked back toward the Greek mainland and the life that waited for him there. The road back from Lydia passed through familiar territory and unfamiliar, through cities he had been to and regions he had not, and he walked it with the particular quality of attention of a person who has learned, through a long series of expensive lessons, not to assume that the next thing coming is going to be better than the last thing that happened. The morning light on the Aegean as he crossed back toward Greece. The water, that particular shade of deep blue that it takes on in autumn. The smell of salt and distance. The road rising toward the hills of the mainland ahead of him. He was going to Calydon. He had a promise to keep. He had defeated 12 monsters. He had walked into death. He had held up the sky. And here he was, spinning thread in a woman's dress, serving a queen who wore his lion skin better than he ever had. Strength, it turned out, was not a permanent condition. It was something you had to keep earning. Calydon was a city on the western coast of the Greek mainland, situated where the land curved toward the Ionian Sea, where the hills came down close to the water, and the light in the late afternoon had that particular quality that coastal places have when the sun is low and the sea is reflecting it back from 2 directions at once. It was a real city with real walls and real people going about the business of their ordinary lives. And it was where Deianira lived. She was the daughter of Oeneus, king of Caledon, and she was someone that the sources, when they bother to describe her as a person rather than a function in the story, describe with a consistency that is itself a kind of testimony. She was capable. She was intelligent. She had a practical clarity about the world that was not cynicism but something more useful, the ability to see situations as they actually were rather than as she wished they were. She had also been promised to the river god Hercules, an arrangement her father had made on her behalf, in the way that powerful fathers sometimes make arrangements for their children without consulting the children. And Hercules was not someone she wanted to spend her life with. Hercules arrived in Caledon with the particular bearing of a man who has completed an enormous thing and is not entirely sure what to do with the space that the enormous thing has left behind. He had come because of a promise to a shade in the underworld. He had come because Meleager had asked him to look after his sister, and he had said he would. He met Deianira. The ancient sources describe what happened between them with a brevity that is, in its own way, telling. There is no elaborate account of courtship, no mythology of divine intervention, or love spell, or arranged fate. There is simply the fact that when Hercules met Deianira, he wanted to marry her, and when Deianira met Hercules, she preferred him to the alternative in a way that grew. Over the time they spent together in those early weeks in Caledon, into something more genuine than preference, Hercules arrived to press his claim. What followed was one of the stranger contests in the mythology. Hercules was a river god, and he fought with the capabilities that river gods possess, which included the ability to change shape into whatever form best served the fight. He became a bull. He became a serpent. He became rushing water. Hercules, who had spent 12 years encountering and solving things that did not behave according to ordinary rules, was not particularly unsettled by any of this. He won. Hercules departed. They were married. The early years of the marriage were good years, and this is not a small thing to say about the life of Hercules, which had not had an abundance of good years. They settled eventually in Thebes, north of the Gulf of Malea, a city that offered them a kind of remove from the larger political complications of the Greek world, a place that was not too close to anyone who had reason to want things from Hercules. They had children. The house in Thebes took on the particular warmth of a place that is being actively used and loved by the people inside it. The warmth that is different from merely being occupied. There were meals and arguments, and the ordinary rhythm of a family living its life. Hercules was present in a way that the years of the labors had not allowed him to be present, genuinely there in the daily texture of things, rather than always somewhere else. Deianira understood early what she had married, and she had married it anyway, which is a different and more honest thing than marrying something without understanding it. She understood that Hercules was constitutionally incapable of the kind of stillness that ordinary domestic life requires as its constant background condition. She understood that he was going to leave, regularly. For the things that his nature and his reputation and the continuing demands of the world he moved through were going to generate, she understood that the scale of him created a context for their marriage that was not the context that most marriages existed in. She had decided this was acceptable, that the person was worth the conditions that came with the person. What she had not fully anticipated was the specific quality of the loneliness that came with it, not the loneliness of the absences, though there were absences, the loneliness of being with someone who was also, in a certain sense, always somewhere else, not inattentive, not cold, not careless. Hercules was none of those things, but the part of him that existed in relation to things she could not fully share, that had been to places and done things that created an experience of existence not quite continuous with ordinary human experience. That part did not become smaller or more accessible because he loved her. She loved him with full knowledge of all this. That is the thing about Deianira that gets lost when she is described primarily as the person who sent the poisoned shirt. She was not naive. She was an intelligent person who understood exactly what she had married and loved him anyway, stayed anyway, and was afraid of losing him anyway. The way you are afraid of losing things whose value you have looked at clearly. There was a night, not long after the wedding, when they needed to cross a river. The river was running fast from recent rain and was not safe to ford. Nessus the Centaur operated a ferry service at that crossing, carrying travelers across on his back for payment. A straightforward arrangement that many people had used without incident. Hercules sent Deianira across first, midway across the river. In the middle of the current, Nessus made a decision. He changed course. He was not going to complete the crossing. Hercules, on the bank, understood immediately what was happening. He reached for his bow. The arrow he selected was one of the Hydra poisoned ones. Because Nessus was in motion across moving water, and the only way to stop what was happening before it progressed was a shot from distance. And at distance you use the most effective tool available. The arrow hit. Nessus went down at the far bank, the poison already moving through him, with the patience that the Hydra's blood brought to everything it touched. Deianira went to him. She went because she was the kind of person who went toward things in distress rather than away from them, even when the things in distress had just done something that should have eliminated any claim they had on her concern. Nessus whispered to her in those final moments. His voice was low and his breathing was already wrong, and the words came out with the careful, deliberate precision of someone using their last available attention to make sure they are understood. "Take some of my blood," he told her. "Collect it before it soaks into the ground. Keep it somewhere safe. If you ever feel that Hercules' love for you is failing, that his attention has gone elsewhere for good, that the marriage is slipping away from you, use the blood, work it into cloth and give it to him to wear against his skin. It will bring him back to you. It will ensure that his love remains fixed on you and nowhere else." He died. Deianira took the blood. She did not use it. Not then. Not in the years immediately after. Not in the long period when things between them were good, and the question of Hercules' love did not feel like an open question. She stored it the way people store things they hope they will never need. Carefully, and in a place she would remember, as insurance against a future that she hoped would not arrive. The marriage continued. The children grew. The house in Thebes held them, and the world outside continued to make its demands. And Hercules continued to meet those demands the way Hercules met everything, with the full weight of what he was, which was considerable, and sometimes left less of him available for the people at home than those people needed. There were expeditions. There were campaigns. There were other women, not hidden with any great care, present in the margins of his life, in the way that such things are present in the lives of people who move through the world at his scale. And this was the part of him that Deianira had made her accommodation with. The painful accommodation of a person who has decided that the alternative to accommodation is worse than accommodation itself. The marriage was real. The love in it was real. That is not a small thing to say about the life of either of them. Given what both of their lives had contained, it was not a perfect love. It was the love that two complicated people with complicated histories build over years of actual shared life. And it had the particular kind of value that things built over time and difficulty have, the value that cannot be manufactured by easier means. For a while, and it was a real while, it was enough. Then he came home from Oechalia with Iole. Oechalia was the city of Eurytus, his old archery teacher, whose son Hippolyta he had killed in the episode that had sent him to Lydia. The history between Hercules and that family was long and complicated and contained within it multiple kinds of loss on multiple sides. Eurytus was dead now, killed in the campaign, and Iole was among the captives. She was young, She was the daughter of the man he had killed. She had been someone Hercules had wanted to marry years before Deianira, before the labors, in an earlier chapter of his life that Eurytus had closed by refusing him. Deianira received the news about Iole before she received Hercules himself. A messenger arrived with information about who was coming and what they were bringing. And Deianira had time, before the procession reached Trachis, to understand what the arrival of this particular woman in this particular context meant. She went to where she had stored the blood of Nessus. She had kept it for years through the good periods and the difficult periods, the absences and the accommodations and the other women in the margins. She had kept it as the thing she was not going to need, the insurance against a future that was not going to arrive. The future had arrived. She took out a piece of wool and worked the blood into it, using the wool to apply the treatment to a white ceremonial robe. She was careful. She handled the blood through the wool and not with her hand directly, aware enough of its nature to be cautious, unaware enough of its actual nature to proceed. She thought she was using a love charm. She thought she was giving her husband something that would bring him back to her. She thought the Centaur had told her the truth. She folded the robe and gave it to Lichas with instructions for its delivery. It was a gift, a formal gift. Appropriate to the ceremony Hercules was preparing to conduct, a mark of her care for him. The kind of thing a wife sends to a husband at a ceremony to signal her presence and her feeling even across distance. Lichas took the robe and traveled toward Euboea, where Hercules was preparing to make a sacrifice to Zeus. The robe was on its way. She loved him in the way that careful people love the things they are most afraid of losing. Attentively, anxiously, with a constant low awareness that it might not last. He loved her back in the way that people love when they have been broken before and healed imperfectly, grateful and protective and not quite believing they deserved it. It was not a perfect love, but it was real, and for a while, it was enough. We have arrived at the place where the story has been pointing since the beginning. Not the end. The end is on the mountain, in the fire, in whatever rises from it. But this chapter is the place where all the threads that have been running through the entire length of this narrative arrive at the same moment and the same location, and produce together the thing that none of them could have produced alone. It is worth taking a moment to lay out the chain, because the simplicity of it, when you see it whole, is one of the most remarkable things about it. A man dipped arrows in a dead monster's blood. He used one of those arrows to shoot a centaur who was attacking his wife. The centaur, dying, told the wife a lie about what his blood could do. The wife believed the lie and stored the blood. Years later, afraid of losing her husband to another woman, she used the blood to treat a garment she gave him as a gift. The garment killed him. That is the whole chain. Every link in it is a decision made by a person with reasons. None of those reasons evil. Most of them defensible, given what the person knew at the time they made them. Hercules prepared weapons for future threats. Nessus acted on desire and then on vengeance. Deianira stored the blood as insurance and used it out of fear. The outcome of all these ordinary human decisions, played out over decades, was the death of the strongest man in the world. This is not the story of a monster powerful enough to defeat him. This is the accumulated logic of his own life. Arriving home, Hercules was at the promontory of Cenaeum on Euboea when Lichas arrived with the robe from Deianira. He was preparing the sacrifice. The altar was ready. The ceremony was about to begin, and the gift from his wife arrived at exactly the moment when he would want to mark the occasion with something received from home. He put it on. The warmth of the morning, the heat of the altar fires, the simple fact of the garment against his skin. For a moment nothing happened, or nothing happened that was visible. The chain of consequence, still moving through its final steps toward him. Then it arrived. The poison of the Hydra, which did not allow wounds to heal, which moved through the body with the patience that made it different in kind from other forms of damage, began to work. It had been in the blood of Nessus, and the blood of Nessus had been in the robe, and the robe was on his skin. And the skin was what the Hydra's poison had been made for. He had dipped those arrows at Lerna. He had been standing in the marsh after the second labor, with the dead Hydra around him, and he had made a practical decision about weapons preparation. The decision of a soldier who understands that the threats ahead will require the most effective tools available. He had not been thinking about Deianira, who he had not yet met. He had not been thinking about Nessus, who was still alive and causing no particular trouble. He had not been thinking about a robe at a ceremony on Euboea decades later. He had been thinking about the next labor, about surviving, about having what he needed for the things that were coming. He reached for the robe to remove it. The robe had already begun to do what the Hydra's blood directed it to do, which was to become continuous with the thing it had touched, to move past the status of a garment and into something else, something that could not be simply removed because the boundary between the robe and his skin had started to dissolve. He pulled. The pulling made it worse. He understood this quickly. The rapid assessment of a situation to determine what actions are available. And the assessment came back with information he did not want. There were no actions available. There was nothing to fight. There was nothing to apply force to. There was no monster across the valley, and no task assigned by the oracle, and no next thing to walk toward once the immediate thing was resolved. There was only this. Lycus was nearby. Hercules saw him. The sources record what happened next, with the factual tone the ancient world used for things that did not lend themselves to easy judgment. Hercules seized Lycus and threw him into the sea. Lycus was the last person to be harmed by the unconstrained weight of Hercules' strength reaching out past his intention. The last time in his life that his capability produced a consequence he had not chosen. He knew, in the pain, that this was not Deianira's doing in the sense of malice. He knew her. He had been married to her for years, and he had paid the kind of close attention to a person that sustained proximity makes possible. She had not done this to hurt him. She had done this because she was afraid of losing him, and she had believed the thing she was given to believe by a dying Centaur who had used his last moments to arrange the most patient revenge available to him. He held this understanding in the pain. Word reached Deianira before the full consequences had arrived at Trachis. She had been waiting for news of the ceremony, for the ordinary confirmation that the gift had been received and the occasion had gone well. Instead, a piece of wool she had used to apply the blood to the robe, left on a windowsill in the afternoon sun, had dissolved, not faded, not stiffened, not changed the way old cloth changes, dissolved. The way things dissolve when what they have been saturated with is not a preservative but a destruction. She understood immediately what that meant about the robe. She went inside. The sources record the outcome with the brevity they bring to all the irreversible things in this story. Hercules received this news on Euboea, in the fire of what the robe was doing to him. He received it, and what the sources record about his response is not rage and not condemnation. He understood. He traced the line from what she had done to why she had done it, and found that every step in it made sense given who she was and what she had been afraid of, and what a dying Centaur had told her in a moment when she had been frightened, and had gone to him out of the same instinct that made her go, toward things in distress. He asked his son Hyllus to come to him. He told Hyllus about Iole. He asked Hyllus, when he was old enough, to marry her. Hyllus was troubled by this request. He agreed. He told Hyllus about the mountain. There was a ridge on Mount Oeta, he said, where you could see the Aegean and the valleys of Thessaly and the wide expanse of the world he had spent his life moving through. He wanted to go there. He needed wood to be cut and stacked. He needed the people who had traveled with him to understand what was being asked, to have the chance to do what they were able to do and to decline what they were not. Hylas organized it. They traveled from Euboea to the mainland and then inland toward the mountain, a procession that moved at the pace that pain and the road between them allowed. He was going to the mountain. In the end, it was not a god that destroyed him, not a monster, not an enemy stronger than himself. It was a shirt, a dead centaur's last whisper, a wife's fear, and arrows dipped in poison a lifetime ago by a man who had no way of knowing where they would eventually arrive. The procession from the coast to Mount Oeta moved at the pace that pain and the road between them allowed, and the road between them was not short. Hercules had made longer journeys. He had crossed Libya under a sun that had no interest in moderating itself for the comfort of travelers. He had walked the full length of the Mediterranean from east to west. He had descended into the underworld and come back. He had made journeys carrying things: the Nemean lion, the Erymanthian boar, the sky, that required resources beyond the ordinary. This journey was different from all of those, in the way that a quality of difference is different from a quantity of difference. The distance was not the difficult part. The distance was only the distance. What was difficult was everything else. The pain that had been constant since Sinaeum, the knowledge of what was at the end of the road, and the particular quality of a journey undertaken without any uncertainty about its destination. Every other road he had ever taken had contained some element of the unknown, even the road to the underworld. As absolute a destination as the ancient world offered, had contained the genuine question of whether he would come back. This road had no such question. He knew where it ended. He had asked for it to end there. Hylas stayed close. The others in the group found their positions and held them. The particular formation that people take around someone who is suffering and who they cannot help except by being present. The mountain rose ahead of them as they came inland, its ridge visible from a long way off. The pine trees, on its upper slopes, dark against the sky. They reached the mountain as the day was going long in the afternoon, the light coming from a low angle that made the shadows of everything stretch out ahead of them toward the east, toward the direction they had come from, toward the sea and the mainland, and the whole of the world that had been his. He chose the place. The ridge was everything he had said it was. From up here you could see the Aegean to the east, the light on it in the late afternoon making it look like hammered bronze, the islands breaking the surface at intervals all the way to the horizon. The valleys of Thessaly spread out to the north, their outlines soft in the haze of distance. To the south, the land ran down toward the Gulf and the cities he had spent his life moving between. The pillars he had set at the edge of the world were somewhere over the western horizon, too far to see but present in the way that things you have done are present, real and permanent and continuing to exist, whether you can see them or not. The pine trees on the ridge stood in the low light with the particular quality of trees at elevation, older and more deliberate than trees lower down. The branches, shaped by years of wind into forms that knew which direction the weather came from. The smell of them was the smell of the mountain above Thebes, the smell of his childhood and the years before everything became what it became. Pine resin and cold air, and the specific clean quality of a place high enough that the smoke and the complications of the world below did not reach it. Hylas and the others cut wood and stacked it. They worked with the focused efficiency of people who have decided that doing the task well is the only form of care available to them. The pyre rose on the ridge in the afternoon light, the pale wood of the pine stacked with the grain running in the same direction, the way a careful person builds a fire when they want it to burn completely. When the pyre was finished, Hercules arranged himself on it. He looked at the people who had traveled with him. He asked who would light it. The asking was the moment that the ancient sources find most worth dwelling on, and they are right to find it so. He asked. He asked more than once. He asked the people who had known him longest. who had been with him in various chapters of the life that had led to this ridge, and each one of them declined. They declined, not out of cowardice, and not because they did not understand what was being asked. They declined because there are things that the body simply refuses to do to someone you love, regardless of what the mind has concluded about whether it would be the right response to the situation. To pick up a torch and apply it to the wood beneath a person who has been a part of your life is a thing that the hands will not carry out, even when the will directs them toward it. They stood at the edge of what was being asked of them, and their hands would not move. Philoctetes was there. He was a young man, a skilled archer, someone who had come with the group in the understanding of what his role was going to be. He had thought about it before the procession began. He had decided, in whatever private process a person goes through when deciding something like this, that he was going to be the one who could do it. Not because it was easy for him, because he understood that it was necessary, and that someone had to be the person who could carry the necessary thing through to the end. He picked up the torch. Hercules saw him coming and reached beside him for his bow. The great bow that had been made for his particular strength, that had shot the Hydra-poisoned arrows at Lerna, and the arrow that had killed Nessus at the river crossing, and the shots that had dropped the Stymphalian birds from the sky above the marsh. He held it out. Philoctetes took it. This bow would become, in the generations after Hercules, one of the most consequential objects in the mythology of the Trojan War. The bow that had been made for the hands of the strongest man who ever lived would eventually be required to end a 10-year siege, would become the object that Odysseus traveled to a deserted island to retrieve, would complete a chain that ran from the marshes of Lerna all the way to the plains below Troy. The arrow that had begun in the poison of the Hydra would find its final purposes through a weapon that had passed from one hand to another on a ridge in central Greece at the end of a long afternoon. Philoctetes lit the pyre. The pine burned with the quality of high-elevation pine, the resin in it making the fire hot and fast, the smoke rising in a column that was visible from the valleys below and from the sea and from the wide reach of landscape that spread out in every direction from the ridge. The smell of it was the smell of the mountain itself, intensified. The particular quality of pine and cold air brought to its fullest expression by heat. The light changed as the fire grew, the late afternoon light from the west and the light of the fire from below meeting somewhere in the middle, creating a quality of illumination that was neither one thing nor the other. The ordinary world and something else occupying the same space for a moment. Lightning came. The sources describe it differently in different versions, but they agree on the divine acknowledgement, the signal from the level of the cosmos above the human world that something was happening on Oeta that was not simply the end of a human life. The lightning was Zeus, in the sense that the story needed him to be there, needed the beginning of this to be present at the ending of it. He had been the origin of all of it. The divine parentage that had given Hercules everything that made him Hercules, and everything that made his life as difficult as it was. He had watched the entirety of it and had not always been able to intervene when intervention might have mattered. But he was present to it, and he was present to this. What the fire took was the part of Hercules that had come from Alcmene, from Amphitrion's house in Thebes, from the years of labor and the night of madness and the marriage and the children and the long road from the beginning to this ridge, the part that was tired, the part that had been carrying things for longer than a person should carry them, the part that had stood in the ruins of his family in Thebes and had stood up anyway, and had walked to Delphi, and had walked to Tiryns, and had walked to 12 impossible places, and then to Lydia and Calydon and Trachis and Euboea, and now here. The walking finally over. What remained was something else, something that had always been there beneath all of it, that the story had been tracing without naming, the part that had been able to hold the sky and walk into the underworld and continue after Thebes and stand on this mountain and ask for the fire. It rose into the night sky above Oeta with the smoke and the light and the particular smell of pine at its fullest. Rising into that sky full of stars that had been looking down on the world since before any of this had happened. Hera met him at Olympus. This meeting is one of the moments in the mythology that requires the whole story to make sense of it. Hera had been his enemy before he was born. She had used her power and her will and every resource available to her to make his life as difficult as the cosmos would permit. She had sent the madness that destroyed his family in Thebes. She had been behind the indirect forms of his suffering throughout the labors and after, the interventions and the complications and the things that could have been peaceful that she would not permit to be peaceful. And now she met him at Olympus, and the enmity between them was over. The sources give various accounts of how this reconciliation worked theologically and cosmologically. What matters is the human truth in it, which is that what Hercules had been through had done, in its own terrible way, what it was supposed to do. The man who emerged from the other side of everything, from Thebes and the labors and Omphale and Deianira and Oeta, was not the same man who had first arrived at the gates of Tiryns with a lion's skin on his shoulders and nothing left to lose. The fire had taken what was burnable. He married Hebe, the goddess of youth, and took his place among the immortals. Whether this was reward or release, or simply the only ending the universe could construct for a man who had never quite fit inside a human life, the story does not say. The sources record it with the satisfaction of people who feel that a shape has been completed. A question that had been open since before he was born, finally answered. The long arc of his existence finally come to its resolution. What had begun in a stretched night in Thebes, in a decision made by Zeus that Hera would not forgive, in the birth of a child who did not ask to be what he was, had come to this ridge in central Greece, to this fire, to this particular quality of smoke rising into a sky full of stars over the Aegean. The pyre burned down through the night. The people who had been on the ridge stayed until it did, until the wood was ash and the ash was cool, and the first light of the following morning was beginning to make itself known in the east, over the water, in the direction he had spent so much of his life moving through. Then they came down from the mountain. The fire took what was mortal, and what remained rose into the night sky above Oeta, above the Aegean, above all the places he had walked and fought and grieved. Whether that was justice or reward or simply the only ending the universe could find for a man who had never quite fit inside a human life, no one could say with certainty. But the fire was warm, and the sky was full of stars, and for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing left to carry. There is a city in northern Greece called Abdera. It was built by Hercules on the site where his friend died, named for a young man who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when horses that ate people were left without adequate supervision. It has been a real city for roughly 2,500 years. People have been born in it and lived in it and died in it and gone about the ordinary business of human existence in it, most of them without spending much time thinking about why the city had the name it had. This is one answer to the question in this chapter's title. We still say his name because he left things behind, not monuments, though there were monuments, not templars, though there were temples in every major city of the ancient world, from Greece to Rome, to the colonies that Rome planted across 3 continents, not the pillars at the strait between Europe and Africa, which sailors passed for centuries with that particular feeling of crossing something that had been marked by a hand larger than ordinary. He left behind a way of understanding certain kinds of human experience that we did not have a language for before the story of his life gave us one. Consider what the story contains. A person born into circumstances they did not choose, carrying from the beginning a burden that was never their fault and that structured their entire existence. A person whose greatest gifts were inseparable from their greatest dangers, whose strength was the source of both everything admirable about them and everything terrible. A person who caused irreversible harm without malice and then spent the rest of their life trying to understand what that meant and what, if anything, could be done about it. A person who came out the other side of 12 years of impossible tasks and found that the thing they had been trying to resolve was still there, patient and unchanged. This is not the story of a superhero. It is the story of a person in the full complexity of what persons are. And the reason it has survived for so long is that the complexity is true in ways that simpler stories are not true. Alexander of Macedon understood this. He carried images of Hercules on his coins and his armor and his official correspondence. He claimed descent from him, and used that claim not simply as a legitimizing device but as a genuine template for understanding his own life and what it required. He wept, the sources say, when he reached the edge of the known world and understood there was nowhere further to go, which is the grief of a man who had made Hercules' story his own story and found, at the end of it, the same exhaustion on the same kind of mountain. The Romans made him Hercules rather than Heracles, and in doing so made him Roman in ways that were genuine rather than simply nominal. They built temples to him at the cattle markets in Rome, which tells you something about where they thought he was most at home. Not in the halls of the powerful, but in the places where ordinary commerce happened, where the goods of the world changed hands, where the practical business of surviving and thriving was conducted by people doing necessary work that did not make them famous. He was their patron of effort that goes unrewarded, of work that is correct and thorough and still does not count, of the labor completed for a cowardly king in a jar who cannot bring himself to share the same room with the person doing his dirty work. That is a version of Hercules that resonates across centuries in ways that the triumphant version does not. Epictetus was a slave. He was owned by a man in Rome in the 1st century, and then freed, and then became one of the most important philosophers the Stoic tradition ever produced. He lectured without writing anything down, and his students wrote down what he said. And what he said has been read continuously for 2,000 years. Epictetus talked about Hercules constantly, not as a figure of athletic excellence or martial achievement, as a figure of what it means to continue in the presence of things you cannot change. He used the labors not as examples of strength, but as examples of sustained effort in the face of arrangements that are unfair, tasks that do not count, work that gets discredited by the powerful for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of the work. He found in Hercules a figure who understood what it meant to accept a sentence you did not deserve and serve it with your full capability anyway. Not because the arrangement was fair, but because the alternative was to stop. And stopping was not something that dignity permitted. This is not the Disney version of Hercules. This is the Hercules who spent 12 years performing impossible tasks for a man hiding in a jar, who had 2 of those tasks disqualified for reasons he could not have anticipated, who completed the sentence and stood outside the gates of Tiryns and discovered that freedom did not feel the way he had imagined freedom would feel. Epictetus saw himself in that figure, and the fact that a freed slave lecturing in Rome found in the mythology of a Greek hero a template for his own experience tells you something important about what the story actually is. It is not a story about strength. It is a story about what you do with strength when strength is not enough. What you do when the thing you are best at is also the thing most likely to cause catastrophic damage. What you do when you have caused that damage and the world does not offer a clean path through the consequences. What you do on the morning after the worst night of your life, when there is no task assigned and no road specified, and you have to choose, out of nothing, to keep moving. The ancient world made him a son of Zeus and gave him divine blood, because that was the only framework available for talking about people who operate at that scale, whose capability places them outside the ordinary human range, in ways that are as much burden as gift. They were not claiming that such people are literally children of gods. They were saying that there is a category of human experience that the ordinary vocabulary of human life is not sufficient to describe. And they were using the language of the divine to point at that category. We still tell his story. We tell it because there is something in the shape of his particular life. The birth he did not choose, and the crime he did not intend, and the sentence he accepted, and the freedom that did not heal him, and the love he could not protect, and the fire on the mountain, that speaks to something in human experience that our frameworks do not fully reach. We tell it because we know people who are too strong for their own good. We know people whose gifts are inseparable from their damage. We know people who have done irreversible things and have to figure out how to continue in the knowledge of those things. We know people who were born into conditions that structured their entire lives before they had any say in the matter. We tell it because the question he carried, the one that ran underneath everything from the morning in Thebes to the night on Oeta, is a question we recognize. Whether the effort is enough, whether continuing, in the absence of resolution and in the presence of everything that has been lost, is sufficient. Whether the carrying of things that should never have been yours to carry can be a kind of dignity rather than simply a kind of damage. Hercules never found a clean answer to that question. He kept walking anyway. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the quality of the dramatic gesture or the decisive moment. It is the courage of the person who stands up on the morning after the worst night of their life and takes the next step, not because they know where they are going or believe that the going will resolve anything, but because the alternative is to stop. The fire on Oeta took what was burnable. It took the accumulated damage and the long wait of everything that had been asked of him and everything he had asked of himself. What remained was the part that continues, not a divine spirit somewhere above the Greek world, something more practical than that, something that travels through time in the form of a story told and retold, in the form of a question that keeps being asked because the people asking it recognize it as their own question, in the form of a name that has been spoken continuously for 2,500 years by people who found in it something they needed and could not find anywhere else. We still say his name. We say it because he was real, in the way that the best stories are real, which is to say not factually but truthfully, not historically verifiable, but humanly recognizable. We say it because somewhere in the story of a man too strong for his own good, too broken to stop trying, too human to ever fully become what the gods wanted him to be, we find something that looks like us, the weight we carry, the mistakes we cannot undo, the question of whether we are more than the worst things we have done, the morning after the worst night, the next step taken without knowing where it leads. Hercules never found a clean answer, but he kept walking anyway. And maybe that, in the end, is enough.